Hey guys, tonight we're slipping through the creaking doors of an Ottoman coffeehouse, somewhere in the beating heart of Istanbul. And yes, it's smoky, loud, and buzzing with every kind of human you'd expect at midnight in a city that never really sleeps. The air smells like roasted beans, singed wood, and that faint tang of sweat from men who've been arguing and laughing for hours already. And here's the kicker. You probably won't survive this job. Between the constant labor, the government crackdowns, and the occasional knife fight over a spilled cup, it's more stressful than your modern 9-to-5, believe me. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the time you're listening in the comments, because I love seeing where in the world we're sharing this moment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle across the uneven wooden floor, a tray in hand, the cups rattling like nervous teeth. This is your first night running the place on your own, and the room feels bigger than it should. Shadows lick the walls where oil lamps gutter and hiss, while curls of smoke drift lazily from long tobacco pipes. Customers lean in close to each other, beards brushing, eyes glittering with gossip and half-suppressed laughter. The room is alive, but every living thing inside it depends on you. On your coffee, your patience, your ability to keep the peace without anyone noticing the strings you're pulling. The beans, roasted earlier today, still release a faint whisper of bitterness, mingling with the thick perfume someone's dabbed onto their collar. You know the ritual by heart, long-handled scissors of brass, the quick stir of water and coffee until the froth just trembles, and that careful pour into cups that can burn lips but soothe hearts. The trick is always in the foam. Too much, and it's bitter. Too little, and they'll accuse you of cheating. And trust me, Ottoman men take their foam dead seriously. Historians still argue whether this obsession was purely aesthetic, or if it tied back to older medicinal ideas about froth carrying essence. Either way, if you botch it, your reputation's toast. The benches creak as a merchant shifts his weight, sighing like the world's tiredest camel. He's already into his third cup, and you make a mental note to keep his saucer filled. He tips better than most. Across the room, two scholars are locked in a verbal duel about whether Aristotle was right about natural motion, their hands slicing the air as if they could grab the truth out of it. They barely notice you topping their cups, but if you forgot, they'd turn that fury on you. Coffee houses like yours have become the classrooms of the street. No tuition, just a coin for a cup, and the right to argue till dawn. Of course, not everyone loves that freedom. You remember the story told just last week, about Sultan Murad for himself storming into coffee houses, sword in hand, ready to enforce his ban. He hated these smoky dens, blamed them for sedition, drunkenness, idleness. The rumor goes he disguised himself and caught more than one poor soul mid-sip, slicing them down before the foam cooled. Is it true? Hard to say. Historians still argue whether those tales were real executions or just heavily embellished warnings. Either way, the memory hovers like smoke above every steaming cup tonight, and you can't help glancing toward the door when it creaks. The night moves in ripples. Someone claps, someone curses, someone laughs so hard his pipe tumbles to the floor. You flit between tables, balancing plates of sugar cubes for those who like a sweet bite with their bitterness, and dried fruits for those with a heavier purse. A quirky little superstition floats through the room. A man explains that if you let the foam cling to the rim and then lick it off, your wish for good fortune in trade will come true. You don't buy it, but you don't interrupt. It's your job to let the myth simmer just as much as the coffee. A boy bursts in from the alley, shouting that janissaries were spotted down the street. The word spreads like fire, everyone pausing mid-sip. Janissaries mean both protection and trouble. They're soldiers, but also rowdy, and they've been known to overturn a table just to make a point. You glance at the brazier, willing the coals not to sputter. The last thing you need is for the room to darken when tempers are high. Still, there's comfort in the routine. Stirring, pouring, setting, smiling, nodding. Your hands learn the rhythm, even while your thoughts wander. The truth is, this job is as much about listening as it is about brewing. Every laugh, every whisper, every muttered curse flows through you, like you're the hidden recorder of the city's heartbeat. If tomorrow someone says war has begun or the price of silk has doubled, it will have first been murmured here, between two steaming cups. You're not just a keeper. You're a gatekeeper of news, scandal, and the small comforts that keep men sane. You steal a moment for yourself at the back, crouched near the brazier, letting the warmth seep into your knees. The fire glows like a living creature, orange and stubborn, a reminder that everything tonight, this crowd, this chatter, this life, depends on something as simple as keeping a handful of coals alive. You sip from a chipped cup, the coffee thick and grainy at the bottom, and let the room blur into one great hum, as if the entire empire is holding its breath in your little shop. You wake before dawn, when the alley outside is still drowned in shadows and the calls of roosters echo like distant trumpets. The shutters of your coffeehouse are closed, but you can already smell the faint ghost of last night's smoke trapped inside, mixed with the sour tang of spilt drink on the wooden planks. You push open the door, and the world greets you with cold air heavy with dew. Your sandals scuff on cobbles slick from the night's mist as you duck back inside and start the ritual of preparing for another long day. The first task is always the beans. You keep sacks of them stored high on the shelf, burlap bulging like fat bellies. They're from Yemen, or so the merchant swore when he sold them, though you know better than to trust every claim. Some beans are smuggled, some stretched with cheaper blends. Still, the aroma when you open the sack is unmistakable. Earthy, sharp, a little sour, but carrying the promise of that dark, bitter kick your regulars crave. You scoop a handful into the mortar, raise the heavy pestle, and begin to grind. It's work that makes your shoulders ache, the rhythmic thud-thud echoing through the stillness, but the smell that rises is worth it. Historians still argue whether this early coffee ritual was more about taste or about ceremony, whether Ottoman men came for the drink itself or for the shared act of watching it prepared. Either way, your grinding carries both, flavor for the tongue, spectacle for the eyes. When you've gathered enough powder, you check the braziers. Last night's embers are nothing but gray dust, so you crouch low and rebuild the fire. Sticks first, then charcoal, coaxed into life with your own breath until orange veins pulse under the black surface. You remember your uncle's warning. Never let the flame die, because a coffee house without fire is like a heart without blood. The next task is sweeping. Ashen crumbs litter the floor, little mementos of laughter and arguments past. The broom scratches across the planks, raising a faint dust cloud that dances in the beams of dawn seeping through cracks in the shutters. Your body protests. Did you even sleep enough? Probably not. But there's no room for laziness. By the time the muezzin calls the first prayer, some eager soul will already be hammering at your door, craving his morning cup. As you sweep, your mind drifts to stranger details. Did you know some folks swear that coffee grounds, if sprinkled across a doorstep, ward off evil spirits? That odd little tidbit comes from your grandmother, who would never brew without saving a pinch of dregs for protection. Quirky or not, you find yourself tapping the bottom of the seive just a little harder, as if to gather enough for luck. Once the floor is swept, you wipe down the low tables. They're scarred from years of elbows and spilled games of backgammon, the surface sticky in spots where last night's sherbet left its mark. You rub at them with a damp cloth until the wood gleams in the dim light, each circle of motion another reminder of how the day will flow. Cup, conversation, cup, complaint, cup, laughter, cup, silence. By now, your neighbors are stirring. You hear the clank of buckets at the well, the muttered greetings of women carrying bread back from the baker. From outside, the scent of fresh simmet, round sesame bread rings, wafts temptingly in, mixing with your rising smoke. You make a note to buy some later, not for yourself, but for the customers who will stumble in with empty stomachs. Coffee alone is sharp. Paired with bread, it feels like a meal. Finally, you check the shelves where your cups rest in neat stacks. Porcelain, some chipped, some whole, brought in caravans from China or copied in local kilns. You trace a crack with your thumb, remembering that each cup carries a story of sailors, merchants, smugglers, maybe even thieves. Some scholars still argue whether porcelain reached Ottoman hands purely through trade or whether it came mixed with loot and spoils. You don't pretend to know the truth. All you know is that customers love to feel worldly with a Chinese cup in hand, even if it's only half real. The room is ready now. The floor gleams, the braziers glow, the shelves stand armed with vessels waiting to be filled. You pause a moment in the doorway, breathing in deeply. The smell of crushed beans lingers on your hands, and your ears are filled with silence, blissful silence, before the noise begins. This is your hour, the liminal time when the city hasn't yet flooded in, when you can imagine the empire is still asleep and the day ahead is yours alone. You pour yourself a first test cup. The sezv hisses as the foam rises, and you carefully tilt it into the waiting porcelain. The coffee is dark as midnight, flecked with gold from the brazier's glow. You sip, bitter, rich, perfect. For a heartbeat, you're not the weary keeper, not the broom wielder or the coin chaser. You're simply a man with hot coffee in a quiet room, enjoying the most precious luxury the empire offers, time. But the peace doesn't last. A fist pounds on the shutter. Your first customer of the day, early as always, demanding entry before the sun itself has stretched across the rooftops. You sigh, set down your cup, and open the door to let the daily tide roll in once more. The shutter rattles as you slide it open, and the first customer steps into your dimly lit room with the entitlement of a man who believes the world owes him its first sip. He's wrapped in a cloak that smells faintly of damp wool and horse sweat, and his eyes dart straight to the brazier. You know the look, that desperate hunger for caffeine before his brain has even caught up with his body. Without a word, you grab a brass sezv, spoon in the freshly ground coffee, add a careful measure of water, and place it over the glowing coals. The ritual begins. You stir just enough to mix, never too much, because the foam is everything. Ottoman coffee brewing is not a slapdash business. It's a performance, a small theater enacted dozens of times a day. Too fast and you scald the grounds, too slow and you disappoint. You watch the surface quiver, tremble, then swell like a proud crest before it threatens to spill. Just then, you lift it, pour a little into the waiting cup, return the sezv to the fire, and coax the foam back again. 3 times if you're feeling generous, 2 if you're pressed for time. The customer exhales with satisfaction when the steaming cup lands before him. No sugar today. He's one of those purists who insists that coffee should be as bitter as life itself. Still, you know others will demand sugar, maybe even spices. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some still like to drop in a pinch of cardamom or even crushed cloves, swearing it cools the heart. A few eccentric sprinkle in black pepper, which frankly tastes like punishment to you. But who are you to argue with tradition? As the man sips, he mutters about how different households brewed differently. That's true enough. Historians still argue whether the sezv method originated strictly in Ottoman kitchens, or whether it evolved alongside Arabic traditions in Yemen and Cairo, refined into this theater of foam and patience. Some claim soldiers carried the technique with them, using hot sand instead of charcoal, perfect for travel. You don't have the final word, but you know what matters. People don't just drink coffee, they watch it being made. The careful stirring, the lifting of the pot, it's a kind of trust exercise between keeper and customer. Soon more arrive. A group of young apprentices tumble in, laughing too loudly for this hour. Their eyes bleary, but their mouths already running with stories from the workshop. They order sweetened coffee, of course, because they haven't yet learned to endure the bitter edge. You prepare their sezvs all in a row, measuring sugar into each one, stirring just so. When you pour, the foam glistens like velvet, and their eyes light up. To them, it's not just a drink, it's permission to sit here and play at being men. One apprentice stirs the dregs at the bottom with his finger, then smears the pattern onto the saucer. He declares that he can read fortunes, and the others laugh, urging him to predict riches or romance. Fortune-telling from coffee grounds. Now that's a superstition that never dies. Your grandmother used to say the shape of a bird meant travel. while a ring meant marriage. You've seen customers grow unnervingly quiet after a saucer revealed bad luck. Whether it's real or not, you let it slide. It keeps them coming back for another cup, another reading. By mid-morning, the coffee house has found its rhythm. Cups clink, says hiss, spoons stir sugar into little whirlpools. The air is thick with steam, smoke, and the occasional sharp crackle of the charcoal. You juggle trays like a circus act, careful never to spill, even when the apprentices lean back too far and nearly topple a table. Coffee here is more than a drink. It's the stage on which men rehearse their lives. They argue over prices, they whisper about girls, they boast about business deals that may or may not exist. Every sip fuels their theater, and you, with your steady hand and quiet nods, are both director and servant. And yet, the ritual has its dangers. You remember the story, half rumor, half warning, about a keeper in Bursa who let his sez boil over too often. Customers said he disrespected the craft. Within a week, his benches sat empty, his braziers cold. Coffee isn't just liquid, it's reputation in a cup. One careless moment, one foamy disaster, and word spreads faster than fire in a silk market. You steady yourself, remembering that your job is balance. Bitter for some, sweet for others. Silent service for the scholar, lively banter for the soldier. Every sez you lift is a test, and the test never ends. The apprentices finish their cups and leave in a burst of laughter, their saucers clattering back onto the table. The first customer of the day lingers, draining the last drop with a satisfied sigh. He sets down his coin, more generous than you expected, and slips out into the now bustling street. You stand by the brazier, wiping your hands on your apron, and realize the morning has already melted into noon. The cups keep coming, the foam keeps rising, and the ritual of brewing, careful, steady, endless, remains the heartbeat of your little world. The day presses on, and with it comes the quiet lull between the morning bustle and the midday flood. You take advantage of the pause, rolling your shoulders and wiping the sweat from your brow. The air in your coffee house is still thick, but now it carries that softer weight of expectation. You know they'll be back soon, merchants and scholars and wanderers alike, and if the place doesn't look welcoming, they'll slide into the rival shop across the lane without a second thought. So you set about arranging the stage. First come the cushions, faded but sturdy, each one plumped by hand. You line them neatly along the benches and against the walls, knowing full well that by nightfall they'll be squashed and sagging from the weight of half a dozen boisterous janissaries. Then the lamps, simple brass holders, each cleaned of soot and filled with oil. Their flames will matter later, when dusk draws the world into shadow and your little shop must glow like a beacon against the dark. Next, the braziers. You position them carefully, not too close to the benches lest someone topple into the coals, but near enough that their warmth spreads evenly. The charcoal whispers as you prod it with the tongs, sending sparks upward like tiny orange stars. The smell of ash clings to your clothes, a perfume that marks you as keeper as surely as any badge of office. Then there's the door curtain, a heavy piece of fabric, embroidered with patterns worn almost to invisibility, but it does its job, keeps the winter draft from cutting through the room, muffles the clatter of the street, and adds a layer of mystery to those inside. Guests push it aside and feel, if only for a moment, that they've crossed a threshold into another world. A world where time moves slower, voices hum softer, and steaming cups appear as if by magic. As you tidy, you notice a stray pipe abandoned under a bench. Its mouthpiece is sticky with resin, its bowl faintly fragrant with last night's tobacco. You shake your head and set it aside, resolving to return it to its owner if he shows up. Quirky detail, but true. Some regulars treat their pipes like pets, insisting on keeping the same one each visit as if it's tied to their soul. You've even heard that a few bury a favored pipe with its owner, as if the afterlife has a smoking section. You step back and take in the room. It's not grand, not gilded like the halls of Topkapi Palace, not sprawling like a caravanserai courtyard. But it's yours, and in this crowded city, that's wealth enough. The walls, though bare, carry echoes, laughter embedded in the wood, debates soaked into the cracks, sighs hanging from the beams. Historians still argue whether coffee houses were meant to imitate mosques in their layout, benches lining the edges like prayer rows, or whether the resemblance is coincidence. You don't claim to know, but you do feel the hush of reverence every time the room is freshly set, waiting for voices to fill it. Your own stomach growls, a sharp reminder that while you serve cups all day, you rarely stop to eat. You chew on a dried fig from your pocket, savoring the sweetness, and let your thoughts wander to the faces that will soon appear. The old scholar with his endless arguments, the merchant who smells of cinnamon, the poet who pays in verses instead of coins until you chase him off. Each has their spot, their cushion, their place in this daily drama. Outside, the city grows louder. Donkeys bray, vendors shout, wheels creak against stone. The scent of fresh bread drifts in, joined by roasted chestnuts from a boy down the lane. You hear the distant muezzin call, and the sound trickles into your room like water through a sieve, blending with the crackle of your coals. It reminds you that your coffee house, humble as it is, sits woven into the fabric of a city that never truly pauses. Your door just one of thousands, yet essential to those who step through it. You give the tables one last polish with your rag, tug at the curtain to make sure it hangs straight, and stoke the brazier until its heat radiates in comforting waves. The stage is set, the actors will soon arrive, and you, keeper, brewer, mediator, cleaner, confidant, are ready to play your part again. The latch clicks as the first figure of the afternoon pushes through the curtain, and with him, the performance resumes. The curtain sways, and in comes your first real wave of the afternoon. Merchants, dusty from the road, with cloaks that smell faintly of camel sweat and sea salt. They clomp in with the air of men who've walked half the empire to land at your door, purses jingling and throats parched. You can always spot them, heavy beards streaked with gray, turbans tied a little looser from travel, and the habit of dropping onto cushions with a groan that seems to shake the floorboards. You move quickly, fetching seives, scooping beans, sprinkling water into the pots with practiced flicks. The first cups are set down steaming, their rims quivering with a thin layer of foam, and the merchants lean forward as though inhaling treasure. Their eyes half close, their shoulders drop. A good cup will do that. Remind even a man buried in ledgers and deals that he still has a pulse. Conversations spark almost immediately. One man brags about selling silk bolts at the bazaar, his voice swelling as if he alone keeps the empire clothed. Another counters with tales of spices from India, his fingers stained yellow from turmeric. They argue, they laugh, they call for more coffee. You know this dance well. Merchants use your benches as their stage to show off, each trying to outtalk the other until the room fills with the smell of cinnamon, pepper, and pride. And you, well, you're the quiet master of ceremonies. You refill cups without interrupting, but you also angle your ear just enough to catch whispers. It pays to listen. The merchants might not tell you their secrets, but they drop hints like breadcrumbs, which caravans are delayed, which ports are tense, which routes are dangerous. Some historians still argue whether coffee houses like yours acted as informal intelligence hubs for the empire. But standing here with your tray, you know the answer. News travels on coffee steam faster than it ever does on horseback. Of course, these men come with quirks. One insists his coffee be brewed with honey instead of sugar, swearing it cures his cough. Another taps his cup 3 times on the saucer before drinking, some odd superstition about warding off bankruptcy. A third always asks you to serve his cup clockwise around the brazier. He claims it aligns with the turning of the heavens. Do you believe it? Not really. Do you humor them? Absolutely. Because a satisfied merchant tips with gold, but an annoyed one complains with thunder. Between pours, you notice the dust settling off their robes, little puffs rising as they shift on cushions. It's like watching the desert slowly seep into your shop, mixing with the smoke of tobacco and the heat of the coals. The air grows thicker, warmer, alive. Your hands never stop moving. Says lifted, foam coaxed, cup placed, saucer balanced, coin pocketed. You feel like a juggler. Only the balls you juggle are scalding hot, and one slip means burned fingers and ruined reputations. One merchant leans in close, lowering his voice. He whispers of unrest near Aleppo, caravans halted, soldiers gathering. Another swears it's nonsense, but their eyes flicker uneasily. You don't comment, but you file it away. Coffee houses thrive on gossip, and gossip has a way of turning into truth when repeated often enough. The room swells with noise. Laughter booms, coins clink, and the merchants' voices rise in waves that wash against your ears. Yet for all their noise, there's a comfort in their presence. Merchants may be brash, but they're reliable. They drink heavy, tip decently, and leave you with stories worth more than the copper in their cups. By the time their plates are empty of figs and their purses lighter from wagers on who sold more silk, you're sweating under your robe, your arms aching from constant pouring. But you keep smiling, keep nodding, because this daily invasion of dusty merchants is the lifeblood of your trade. Without them, the benches would be empty, the braziers cold, and your shop just another forgotten stall in the city's maze. They rise at last, shaking crumbs from their robes, leaving behind saucers sticky with sugar and cushions sagging from weight. The curtain flutters shut after them, and for a moment, silence returns, thick, smoky, and sweet with the lingering smell of roasted beans. You take a breath, refill your own cup, and brace yourself. The next crowd will be along any minute, and you'll need just as much patience, just as much foam, to keep the day flowing. No sooner have the merchants' echoes faded than a quieter group slips in, almost like shadows carried on the afternoon light. These aren't men chasing profits or boasting of caravans. These are the scholars, the thinkers, the soft-voiced men whose robes hang looser, whose fingers are ink-stained, and whose eyes glow with a mixture of fatigue and stubborn fire. They shuffle toward their usual corner, a low bench near the wall where the smoke drifts upward in lazy curls, giving them just enough privacy to argue without shouting. You know their kind well. They'll nurse a single cup for hours, letting it cool to mud at the bottom while their tongues blaze hotter than any brazier. And so you prepare the seize with the patience of a monk, measuring the coffee powder with exacting care. Scholars always notice. Too weak, and they'll accuse you of insulting their intellect. Too strong, and they'll claim you're trying to burn their tongues into silence. You coax the foam just right and pour it into delicate porcelain, setting each cup down with reverence. The conversation begins even before you've finished placing the saucers. One man quotes Aristotle, his hand slicing the air like a sword. Another counters with verses from the Quran, voice smooth as silk, trying to weave philosophy and theology into one fabric. A third interrupts with a Persian poet's couplet, half sung, half sighed. It's like watching men build a tower out of words, each stone stacked precariously higher until the whole thing wobbles with the weight of pride. You drift back to your brazier, listening without seeming to listen. Coffee houses have long been the playground of ideas. Historians still argue whether they truly acted as schools of the street, where common men could engage in lofty debates, or whether that's just nostalgia painted over reality. But from your corner, hearing these men wrestle with Aristotle and Al-Ghazali in the same breath, you feel the truth humming in the wood. And yet, for all their seriousness, scholars bring their own quirks. One insists on swirling the grounds 3 times before setting the cup down. He claims it awakens hidden meanings. Another refuses to drink until he's recited a prayer, murmuring so softly you can barely hear. And then there's the eccentric who always asks for a sprig of mint in his coffee, declaring it keeps the mind sharp. Does it work? Who knows? But you keep mint on hand, just in case. As their arguments heat, their voices rise, drawing glances from other patrons. You feel the tension crackle like the brazier coals. Will today end in scholarly laughter or in a storm of slammed fists? Sometimes it's both. Last week, 2 of them nearly came to blows over whether the stars influence fate. One hurled his cup to the ground, foam splattering across your floorboards, and stormed out. The other simply ordered another drink, muttering about ignorance. You spent the rest of the night wiping up sticky grounds. Still, you respect them. For all their noise, their debates carry weight. News filters through them as much as through merchants. You've heard whispers here first, new decrees from the palace, rumors of wars in distant provinces, tales of scientific instruments arriving from Europe. One scholar even brought a strange brass device with spinning rings, an astrolabe, and laid it on the table like a holy relic, explaining the heavens over sips of coffee. The merchants laughed, the apprentices gawked. But you? You remembered. There's a strange power in watching them. They sip, they argue, they forget the world outside, and you, keeper of cups, silent witness, are the one who makes it possible. Without your steady sieves, their words would dry in their throats. Without your warm benches, their minds would wander home. You are the quiet anchor of their storm. As the afternoon light fades and the call to prayer threads through the curtain, their voices soften. One scholar sighs, another rubs his temples, and they cradle their cups like tired children. The debate will never end. That's the secret. It will stretch across nights and years, across benches and cities. Historians still argue whether these debates shaped policy or merely filled time. But you know that here, in this smoky corner, men believe they're shaping the world. And belief, as you've learned, is often stronger than truth. You gather their empty cups, sticky with cooled dregs, and smile faintly. The scholar's corner has done its work for today, stirred minds, tangled ideas, and left you with another layer of smoke on your ceiling. The brazier crackles. Outside, the city shifts toward evening. Inside, you brace for the next tide of humanity, each wave as different as the last, yet all bound together by the dark liquid you conjure from beans and fire. The scholars shuffle out with their scrolls tucked under their arms, still muttering half-sentences as though their arguments will follow them through the streets. Their corner is barely empty before another sound fills the room, the sharp, rattling clack of a backgammon board being unfolded. The apprentices are back, and with them, the unmistakable energy of games. You know this routine. They slap the board down, scatter the dice, and jostle for space on the benches. Coffee is barely their concern now. They'll sip it only to wet their throats between shouts. You bring out 2 cups anyway, because the house looks stingy without steaming saucers, and set them down beside the board. The foam still quivers when the first die bounces across the wood, knocking against the pieces with a clatter that echoes like tiny drums. Backgammon, tavla, as they call it, is the king of coffeehouse games. Men play it the way others pray, with focus, devotion, and just a hint of desperation. They slam the checkers down with exaggerated force, as though the weight of their move could intimidate the dice into rolling in their favor. The room vibrates with the rhythm. Clack, rattle, shout, laugh. You've seen men lose a month's wages over these boards, then come crawling back the next night, as if fortune might suddenly favor them. A new pair begins a round in the far corner. Dice tumble, pieces scatter, and already the debate starts. Did the roll count if it landed cocked against the board's edge? One player insists yes, the other swears by his mother's grave that it doesn't. They look at you, keeper, judge, unwilling referee. You shrug, pour more coffee, and let them fight it out. Better to feign ignorance than to choose sides. Of course, tavla isn't the only diversion. A boy in a faded vest produces a small pouch and spills its contents onto the table, dice, worn smooth from years of rolling. The game begins, quick bets laid on who will strike double sixes. It's harmless enough until coins start appearing, then larger wagers, then the occasional jeweled ring. Gambling, technically forbidden, thrives in your smoky room like ivy in a shaded garden. Historians still argue whether coffeehouses were dens of vice or merely reflections of human nature. But watching these boys shout over a pair of cubes, you know the truth leans closer to the latter. You've heard quirky stories too. Some men claim rolling dice on a Quran guarantees luck. Others whisper that rubbing them with coffee grounds brings fortune. One eccentric swore he could hear the dice sing and predict the outcome by ear. He was wrong every time, but the confidence was worth the price of admission. The noise builds as more players join in. Apprentices slam their checkers, merchants call wagers, and a cluster of spectators leans close, their breath fogging the table's surface. You maneuver through them with your tray, balancing cups like a tightrope walker, dodging elbows and half-swung arms. A spilled drink here would be disaster, staining the board and killing the game. But your hands are steady, practiced, and you weave through the chaos with the grace of someone who has done this dance 1,000 times. There's a kind of poetry in the games. Life itself plays out in those rattling dice and clattering checkers. Chance versus skill, patience against impulse, luck mocking certainty. You watch men who command caravans reduced to groaning children over a bad roll. You watch apprentices puff their chests like kings when fortune smiles. And through it all, you hear laughter, boisterous, ragged, but genuine. Coffee fuels it, yes, but the games ignite it. A sharp cry splits the air, victory. One man leaps to his feet, arms raised, while the loser slumps forward, covering his face with both hands. The crowd roars approval, coins exchange hands, and the room pulses with energy that makes the braziers glow feel brighter. You smile despite yourself. This is the rhythm of your evenings. Foam, fire, and games clattering like thunder until the night wears thin. As the players settle into new rounds and dice begin to dance once more, you glance at the brazier, feeding it another scoop of charcoal. Sparks leap upward, like dice tumbling in the fire's own invisible game, and you whisper a half-prayer that the coals will last as long as the night does. The rattling of dice fades a little as men lean back, satisfied with their winnings, or nursing their losses in silence, and you catch the moment to shift the mood. Too much noise, and the coffeehouse risks becoming a brawl. Too much smoke, and it becomes unlivable. You take up the slender clay pipes resting near the brazier and begin arranging them along the shelves, letting the regulars catch sight of their chance at a different indulgence. The tobacco is damp, packed in small leather pouches, its scent earthy and sharp. Some swear by Syrian leaves, others by Anatolian, but whatever the origin, the ritual is the same. You press the dark strands into the bowls, tamping them just so, and set the coals carefully atop. When the first puff snakes upward, the men lean forward like children watching a magician's trick. A hiss, a gurgle, then a slow exhale. Smoke drifts through the room in ribbons, curling like calligraphy across the lamplight. It clings to the rafters, weaving with the already thick air of roasting beans and charcoal. Too heavy, and your patrons cough. Too thin, and they complain it isn't worth the coin. Balance is your art. You don't just keep a coffee house, you sculpt the very air. But smoke has its moods, and you've learned to tame it with perfume. Beside the counter sits a small glass vial filled with rosewater, another with clove essence. You dip a cloth, flick it across the brazier stones, and watch as the sweetness rises to mask the harsher burn. Some nights you even sprinkle orange peel or crushed cardamom, letting the scents drift until they mingle with the coffee's bitter perfume. It becomes a tapestry, roasted beans, glowing tobacco, sweet rose. Men close their eyes and sigh, imagining they're in gardens far beyond these streets. One foreign traveler once told you the air in your coffeehouse smelled like paradise after rain. You weren't sure if he was drunk or sincere, but the compliment stuck. Of course, there are quirks too. Some eccentric patrons swear that adding a drop of musk to the coals keeps evil spirits away, while others dab their beards with rosewater so the scent clings to them as they leave, proof to their wives that they'd been somewhere respectable rather than a gambling den. You've even seen men blow smoke into each other's turbans for luck. Though whether it works, only the dice players can tell. Still, not everyone approves. Historians still argue whether tobacco was truly beloved or begrudgingly tolerated in Ottoman society. Some chroniclers claimed pipes softened men's resolve, making them lazy, while others insisted they encouraged sociability, keeping tempers cool and tongues loose. You, watching them recline against your cushions and share a pipe in companionable silence, lean toward the latter. The brazier pops. You adjust the coals, then tap another pinch of rosewater across the hot stones. Instantly the air shifts, sharp heat mellowing into sweetness. The chatter lowers, as though the scent itself softens voices, and for a moment you imagine the room afloat, carried on clouds of smoke and perfume, drifting far from the streets outside. You move through it with your tray, like a sailor steering through fog. Cups clink, pipes hiss, laughter ripples, and you feel the night settling into its stride. The scholars had their debates, the apprentices their games. Now comes the haze, the drowsy lull, the sigh of men surrendering to comfort. You lean against the counter, wipe your hands on your apron, and inhale deeply. Bitter coffee, sweet rose, earthy smoke. It's chaos, yes, but chaos with rhythm. You know it, you guide it, and for tonight at least you tame it. The door swings, and they arrive as if summoned by the very scent of your brazier. The storytellers. They come with satchels and scarves, with a bundle of props slung over an arm, and a face full of practiced mischief. A meta, the old professional, or a young reciter with a quick tongue. Either way, you feel the room tilt a degree toward attention the moment they step in. People set down cups. Even the dice players pause with a half motion that becomes a full one. Somewhere near the back a scholar rubs his chin and leans forward so that the smoke frames his profile like a portrait. You know, in the same rueful way you know the right time to coax a says foam. Storytellers command a room the way coals command heat. They take the central bench as if it were a stage and unpack their life in small, bright gestures. A meta will slap a drum to call silence, produce a ragged puppet, and make a face that seems older than the empire. The younger reciter will clear his throat and sing, shaping vowels into images. Props clink. An old slipper becomes a talking jester. A strip of mirror becomes a sun. A reed whistle answers a character's laugh. And the audience folds around the performer like water around a stone. You move through them with your tray, feeling the current of expectation, listening for the rhythm that lets you know when to step back and when to offer a top-up of coffee. Watch how they construct the evening's world. A story often begins with the trivial. The missing ring, the nosy neighbor, the humble tailor who tries on a sultan's coat. And then, through cunning switches of voice and timing, the tale stretches into something larger. The tailor suddenly finds himself sitting in the palace, robes too large for his shoulders, and anyone who has ever dreamed of more than his station laughs that double laugh, delighted and afraid. Jokes land that sting the powerful without naming them. Satire is an art of suggestion. The meta is mimicry, voice lowered to a wheeze for the miser, raised to a proud bellow for the official, teaches the crowd to see the world in a new key for the price of a cup. Here's a straight historical fact you can drop casually between sips. Metas and Karagah's shadow plays were indeed staples of Ottoman popular entertainment. Karagah's shadow puppetry, with its broad, pointed satire, often played to coffeehouse audiences from the 16th century onward. The idea of silhouetted figures swaggering across a stretched cloth while a lamp throws their jokes into huge, ridiculous shapes. Well, it's delightful and dangerously effective. A crowd sees a caricature of the governor in charcoal on linen, and suddenly the governor's faults are not abstract news, but communal mockery. Of course, along with the mainstream there's the odd and the fringe. One elderly regular insists that a certain meta learned to imitate every bird that nests along the Bosphorus simply by sitting on his rooftop for a summer and copying their calls until his throat cracked. Another swears that a gifted reciter can make two listeners dream exactly the same scene after a particular turn of phrase. You raise a brow at that one, but the boy at the far table swears his mother dreamed of a jasmine garden the same night she heard the tale. People love to believe in the little miracles of performance. Superstition lubricates the social engine of the house as surely as sugar sweetens coffee. The tension in every joke is political as well as poetic. Historians still argue whether these performances were mainly entertainment or whether they functioned as veiled political commentary. Subtle, coded probes at the limits of speech in a society that could turn satire into trouble. You feel that line in the room. A joke about a blind tax collector will crack the crowd up, but it will also cause a man near the door to check his cloak for emissaries. The art of telling a story here is partly the art of self-preservation. Frame the barb as a fable about foolishness, and should a patron of higher rank complain, you can always shrug and claim you were only amusing old friends. Sometimes those veiled barbs are blunt enough to cause trouble. You remember a night when a meta joked about an official who charged for air and taxed silence. The Janissary in the corner laughed too loudly, and the joke landed with a sideways punch. The next morning a rumor breathed through the bazaar that an inspector had been seen walking this neighborhood. You folded your curtains a little tighter that day. Stories are catalytic. A sharp line can light a rumor that winds up where you do not want it. At the palace gate, on the lips of a magistrate, in the ledger of a man who counts loyalties as wealth. But the tales are not all knives. Many are medicine. Lovers crouch into the benches and hear about impossible devotion. Fathers wipe their beards at a parable about generosity. The older women who occasionally slip in while the crowd is denser listen for the moral tucked into the laughter. A meta can stitch a lesson so subtly into the folds of a joke that no one can accuse him of sermonizing. Yet for a listener who needs it, that lesson lands like a warm blanket. For all the ribaldry and the mockery, these recitations can be small, necessary kindnesses. Performance here is cross-disciplinary. Sometimes the Karagaz troupe will lay a sheet and let shadows do the broad strokes. Later a meta will stand and sharpen the satire with human voice, mimicking the shadow's crude insults with a human malice that's somehow more cutting. Musicians slip in refrains, a soft oud accompaniment here, a reed flute punctuating a punchline there, turning the recitation into a multi-sensory trick. You see a pattern. The arts here invite each other to borrow costume and line and tempo until the coffeehouse becomes a workshop of culture as much as a place to drink. And there are tiny backstage tricks you learn to treasure. Seasoned storytellers carry little things that keep the illusion whole. A pinch of sugar to stop a cough, a scrap of cloth to make a child's puppet quieter, oil to soften a puppet's leather so it will glide more convincingly. Tonight a meta notices a restless child and fashions a paper boat that becomes the centerpiece of a seafaring yarn. The boy forgets his restlessness, and the whole audience quiets to watch. Those small mercies are as vital as your coals. They hold attention, and buy safety from the kind of chaotic noise that breaks suspense and invites quarrels. There's an economic logic too. Good storytellers are paid in coins and in fame. A popular reciter will draw a larger crowd, meaning more cups sold, more tobacco puffed, and a fuller coin pouch at day's end. Sometimes a generous listener will commission a private rendition, a love story framed just so for a bride's ear, and those pay better than applause. You keep a ledger in your head, who pays well, who listens fast, who tips in story for story. The storyteller's coin is your coffeehouse's keep. As the night deepens, the meta's voice can wobble between comic and tender. He'll pull a trick in the middle of laughs, drop the tone, slow the cadence, and for one breathless minute the room is held like a suspended cup. In that hush you are reminded, you didn't open this shop merely to trade beans for coins. You opened it to host human commerce of a subtler sort, trade in feeling, exchange in memory. The meta packs his things eventually, his pockets lighter, his head full of new lines to try elsewhere. He folds himself into the dark, leaving the room humid with story and sticky with applause. When the curtain falls and you sweep the floor, you carry more than crumbs. Snatches of jokes, the shape of a new proverb, the impression of a barbed line that will appear in tomorrow's gossip. Storytellers leave traces, phrases repeated in the market, a mimicry borrowed by a merchant to clinch a sale, a thrown-back punchline used by an apprentice to shame a friend. That is how culture moves, not only through official edict, but through the repeated, living mouth of your little coffeehouse. You set your tray down, listen to the last of the laughter die away, and catch your reflection in a polished saucer. Tired, pleased, slightly filthy from another night well staged. You think of the bird imitator and the boy with his paper boat and imagine, briefly and foolishly, that perhaps these stories do more than pass time. They bind you tonight to every stranger who laughed in your room. The brazier crackles. You close the curtain a little tighter, but inside the echoes of the meadow's voice seem to have settled like a second smoke. One you wouldn't sweep out if you could. The games begin before the storyteller's echoes have even finished fading. A pair of apprentices slides a low wooden table into the circle of lantern light. its legs wobbling but steady enough to hold dice and boards. The clatter of little cubes, the tap of carved pieces. Backgammon is the reigning king of these tables, tala as some call it, a grid of fate where men test not only their luck but their tempers. You, balancing your tray, know that when dice strike wood, cups will need refilling faster. Coffee fuels bravado, and bravado fuels wagers. Observe how the regulars take their places. The old tailor with his cracked nails insists on the corner seat, the dice warming in his palm before each throw. A spice merchant, all cinnamon and musk in his sleeves, arranges his counters with the precision of an accountant. A janissary sprawls opposite, his hand heavy on the table, rolling without finesse, but with such force that the dice seem bullied into good numbers. Around them cluster boys, errand runners, and the poor who can't afford a stake, but will happily lend their shouts to every good throw. Backgammon has history deep in Persia and the Levant, and in the Ottoman house it flourishes like ivy. Every coffee house worth the name has its boards. Dice themselves, those little ivory or wooden cubes, are older still, and with them the suspicion of danger. You've heard clerics decry the games as pathways to sin. You've also heard that one caliph once outlawed dice after losing too many times. Still, men roll. They always roll. Games promise the illusion of control, and in a city where the sultan's mood or a drought upriver can undo fortunes, that illusion is intoxicating. You circulate and listen to the slang that flows as freely as coffee. To chase the pip, to bar the fool, to dance on the door. Each phrase is half code, half spell, a way to give personality to the shifting tokens. A man doesn't just lose a point, he is ambushed, his soldiers captured, his gate stormed. Thus the board becomes a battlefield in miniature, each piece a janissary or horse, each throw of dice a campaign decided. In a world drenched with empire, even play must echo war. Sometimes the stakes are nothing more than pride, a shout of triumph, a mock curse. Other nights, coins click onto the table. Silver axes, a rare Venetian ducat, even promises written on scraps of paper. Wagers build until the room tilts toward frenzy. You know well enough to hover near such tables, for where money changes hands quickly, tempers flare faster. A lost coin can sour a friendship, and a bad throw can turn a man's mouth cruel. More than once you've had to step in with a soft joke or a refill, diffusing tension with the careful diplomacy of a seasoned host. Not all play is board and dice. Men lean against pillars with counters in hand, playing Mangala, the pebble game with little pits carved into wood. The rhythm of dropping stones, the soft chink, is calmer than the backgammon's dice storm. It feels older, slower, almost pastoral, as though shepherds by the fire smuggled it into the city. In a corner, boys invent rules with walnuts and bottle caps, and soon their shouts rival the grown men's. Games breed games. The coffee house is a hive of invention. Even the religious line is blurry here. Some scholars argue that such play distracts from prayer, that dice invite chance into a world where divine will should rule. Others shrug and say that moderation is key, that laughter at a board is no different from a jesting tale. You watch men of faith roll their dice while muttering Bismillah before the throw, sanctifying their luck with the same words that bless their meals. It seems, in your room at least, that play finds a way to reconcile itself with piety. Gossip slides across the boards as smoothly as counters. A player will boast of a throw, then lean close to whisper that the governor's nephew has been caught in a scandal. Another will laugh at his misfortune, then mutter about troop movements in Hungary. The dice mask the danger of words. The game provides a cover. It is no accident that states have sometimes tried to ban both coffee and the games it hosts. They fear not the laughter, but the murmur beneath it. Yet joy is undeniable. The cry when a player rolls double sixes, the roar when a long, impossible comeback unfolds. It shakes the beams of your ceiling. For a moment, the whole crowd is united not by religion or rank or craft, but by the fall of dice, the march of counters. In that fleeting roar, there is democracy. And then there are the cheats. Always, in every house, someone presses the dice too long in his palm, or slides a piece half a pip forward, or coughs at the right moment to mask a sleight of hand. The crowd notices, of course, they always notice. Justice in your coffeehouse is swift. A chorus of mockery, sometimes a forced repayment, occasionally a shove toward the door. Cheating offends not because of the coin, but because it insults the shared illusion of fairness. Break that, and you risk the house itself. You keep boards stacked by the wall, knowing that they are as vital to business as the says themselves. Coffee brings men through your door. Games keep them long enough to order twice. In the rhythm of dice and counters you hear your own income ticking, a kind of second pulse beneath the boiling pots. You suspect that even if the Empire outlawed every bean tomorrow, some men would still gather here, if only to gamble with stones. Tonight, the games run deep. A boy wins 3 times in a row and struts like a vizier. The janissary, humiliated, demands another round until his purse grows lighter than his cup. A merchant loses with grace and slips you an extra coin for your trouble. By the time lanterns sputter, the dice are warm, the boards scarred, and the room heavy with that peculiar blend of rivalry and fraternity. You sweep the last counters into their box and wonder, do these men leave richer in coin or poorer, wiser in patience or more foolish in risk? The truth is that the games serve the same purpose as the stories, the songs, the gossip. They allow men to test the world in miniature. Luck, strategy, loss, triumph, all rehearsed safely at a table, softened by smoke and coffee. Outside, fate is brutal and unyielding. Inside, fate is 2 dice in the hand. And as you bank your coals for the night, you admit to yourself that you, too, are caught by the spell. Sometimes, when the room is empty, you roll the dice once or twice on a clean board. The sound is comforting. The promise that chance, at least here, can be contained within wood and rules. A small comfort, but one that feels as necessary as coffee itself. The smoke is always there, soft and gray, rising in lazy ribbons that curl around the lamps and turn the rafters hazy. You could sweep the floor every hour, and it would still smell of charred leaf and oil, because the narghiles never really stop glowing. A newcomer might cough at first, but after a few minutes the haze becomes part of the room. Like incense in a mosque or grease in a bakery, it clings to everything. You wipe soot off the windows each morning, knowing they will fog up again before sunset. The hubble-bubble sound of water pipes is almost musical. Men lean back against cushions, hands wrapped around the long stems, smoke exhaled like sighs of satisfaction. The tobacco itself, well, that's an import, often Syrian or Persian, sometimes cut with herbs to stretch it. There are whispers that certain bold coffee houses experiment with opium or hashish, but you keep your distance from that crowd. One official raid could strip your livelihood, and besides, you've seen what stronger fumes do to a man's eyes. Tobacco alone is enough to make customers generous and relaxed. A single charcoal ember glows like a tiny sun atop the clay bowl. Your apprentice has the unenviable job of keeping them alive, trotting back and forth with tongs, balancing glowing coals like offerings. Sometimes he burns holes in his tunic, sometimes in your patience, but the ritual is essential. Smoke without heat is nothing. Guests will forgive weak coffee sooner than a cold pipe. You've learned a few tricks, dropping a clove into the bowl for sweetness, or sprinkling rosewater on the stem's cloth wrapping so the inhalation carries a floral breath. A merchant once swore that a pinch of dried orange peel cured melancholy. Another insisted that mint sharpened the mind for chess. Whether any of it works hardly matters. Half the pleasure of the narghile is imagining that each puff carries more than smoke. Mainstream history tells you that tobacco reached Ottoman lands through sailors and traders, spreading from the Americas by way of Spanish and Portuguese ships. By the 17th century, it had become a craze, just like coffee. You can almost picture the court debating, does this strange plant corrupt morals, or is it merely another habit to tax? Some sultans outlawed it, citing fire hazards and moral decay, but the bans rarely held. Men hid pipes in cellars, women smoked behind lattice screens, and soon enough the law bent to reality. A quirkier rumor circulates in your circle, that some early smokers believed the pipe could ward off plague. The logic went that constant inhalation of hot smoke cleansed the lungs of bad air, those invisible miasmas thought to carry disease. You've even heard one old patron swear that he survived a cholera wave thanks to a steady diet of tobacco fumes. Whether true or not, you keep your doubts quiet. Better a superstition that comforts than none at all. Historians still argue whether tobacco's spread was more cultural rebellion than genuine taste. Was smoking a quiet protest against state bans and clerical frowns, or simply fashion borrowed from sailors and merchants? You don't have the answer, but you see every night that the pipe offers men something coffee alone cannot. A slow ritual, a reason to linger, a shared rhythm of breath. The narghileh is also a stage. The way a man inhales, how long he holds the smoke, how languidly he exhales, it all signals personality. The janissary blows rings to amuse the crowd. The scholar lets out thin wisps like lines of poetry. The merchant swallows half a bowl and bursts into coughing fits, pretending it was deliberate. Each puff becomes part of the conversation, punctuating jokes and arguments alike. But the smoke also shapes the air of secrecy. Voices lowered under the haze feel private, even when spoken aloud. Lovers pass notes behind curtains, rebels whisper plans through clouds, poets recite verses half hidden. You sometimes wonder if the government understands that smoke itself is a shield, hiding words from prying ears. Perhaps that's why bans were so fierce in their time, not only against the plant, but against the possibilities it protected. Late at night, when the fire dies down, you watch the bowls cool, the last embers flickering like fallen stars. Ash drifts into the water, the bubbling slows, and the stems are laid aside. What lingers is the after smell, sweet, acrid, heavy. You scrub your hands, but the scent follows you home, into your bedding, into your dreams. And though you sometimes grumble at the soot on your walls, you admit the truth. Without the smoke, the house would feel bare. It softens the edges of the night, blurs strangers into companions, makes secrets safer and laughter thicker. The coffee may bring them through the door, but the smoke ensures they never rush to leave. You can feel the shift even before the first complaint, something in the way the room grows hushed when a stranger passes by the open door. Coffee houses like yours thrive on chatter, laughter, and smoke, but always there's the risk that the wrong pair of eyes is watching. Everyone in the trade knows it. These rooms are as much under suspicion as they are beloved. The authorities call them dens of idleness, or breeding grounds for sedition. It's not entirely wrong. You've heard verses mocking viziers, or gossip about tax collectors, or even bold whispers about the sultan's court, passed along between mouthfuls of bitter brew. Sooner or later, that kind of talk draws the ears of watchmen. And those men, in their patched uniforms and half-polished boots, make their living reminding you that indulgence must be paid for. The sound of their approach is almost theatrical. The jangle of keys, the heavy stomp of boots, and the little pause at the doorway, as if they're gauging how much fear they command tonight. You know the script. A glance around, a cough into the smoky air, then a pointed remark about keeping things respectable. If you're clever, you'll already have coins hidden in your sleeve. It's not that you enjoy bribing anyone, but you've learned it's better to play the game. Too much resistance, and they'll drag you before the magistrate, accuse you of corrupting morals, or worse, of harboring conspirators. Too much generosity, though, and they'll keep coming back, like cats who've tasted cream. The trick lies in the middle. Enough coin to satisfy, enough dignity to discourage repeat performances. Mainstream history notes that coffee houses were often shut down outright, sometimes by decree of sultans like Murad IV, who in the 17th century banned both coffee and tobacco under threat of severe punishment. Officially, these bans were moral campaigns, guarding against sloth and sin. Unofficially, everyone suspected the real concern. The gathering of men unsupervised, talking freely, plotting who knew what. Even then, the state understood that words could be as dangerous as weapons. A more peculiar tidbit has drifted down to you from older keepers. They claim that during one crackdown, officials disguised themselves as wandering dervishes to slip inside and eavesdrop. Picture it. Holy men with long beards sitting cross-legged, nodding gravely, while secretly memorizing names for their reports. Whether it truly happened or not, the story survives as a warning. Never assume the quietest guest is harmless. Historians still argue whether these raids were genuinely effective at curbing dissent, or if they simply trained people to whisper more softly. After all, coffee houses flourished again and again, no matter how many padlocks clamped their doors. Some scholars think the bans were more symbolic gestures of authority, flexing power rather than wielding it consistently. When raids do happen, you feel the room hold its breath. Patrons look down, dice are shoved into pockets, pipes hidden under cushions. Someone coughs loudly to break the tension. You stand straight, paste a humble smile on your face, and pray your apprentice doesn't blurt something foolish. There was one evening, rain streaking the shutters, thunder rattling the beams, when a group of armed men barged in without warning. They didn't ask for coin. They smashed cups, kicked over the brazier, shouted accusations of sedition. For a moment you thought it was the end. But just as suddenly, they left, leaving embers scattered on the floor and your heart racing. The message was clear: the space is never entirely yours. Yet the danger carries its own allure. Customers laugh later about the close call, boasting that they kept their nerve, pretending they weren't trembling behind their beards. It becomes part of the coffeehouse legend, retold with embellishments until it sounds more like an adventure than a threat. In a strange way, each raid ties the regulars closer together. They've shared the fear, so they share loyalty too. You've become skilled at subtle defense. The storyteller knows how to shift a bawdy verse into a religious parable when the door creaks. The musicians can soften their songs into harmless laments. You yourself have mastered the art of pouring coffee slowly, very slowly, to buy time while you measure the tone of a new arrival. When the last inspector leaves and the lamps settle into their steady glow again, you feel both drained and strangely proud. You've survived another dance with authority, preserved your space for one more night. You wipe the counters, replace the cups, coax laughter back into the room. And though you grumble about the coins lost to bribes, you know the truth. As long as men crave smoke, stories, and company, they'll come back. And as long as they come back, you'll find a way to keep the doors open, even if it means nodding politely to the same watchman who would happily shut them forever. The tension of watchmen fades, and you can almost hear the room sigh with relief. It's in that softened silence that another rhythm begins, as natural as the bubbling of coffee. The slow pluck of strings, a hush falling over the regulars, and the first hesitant notes of a lute winding through the smoky air. Music always sneaks in like this, unannounced, casual, yet irresistible. A man with calloused fingers sits cross-legged, oud resting against his knee, coaxing deep, resonant notes that make even the most restless gambler pause mid-roll of dice. Soon a frame drum joins in, its hollow thump a heartbeat for the room, steady and grounding. A reed flute follows, thin and reedy, weaving in like smoke rising from a pipe. The blend is hypnotic, and before long, conversations soften to background murmurs, cups clink gently, and the coffeehouse transforms into something almost sacred. You've learned that music is more than entertainment. It's a signal. It tells newcomers this is a place of culture, not just caffeine and chatter. Merchants straighten their robes, scholars lean closer, apprentices hush themselves. Even the storyteller times his entrance to the rhythm, letting the lute carry him in like a herald's trumpet. Mainstream history records how Ottoman coffeehouses became hubs for music, especially improvisational folk traditions. In Istanbul alone, entire reputations were built around which coffeehouse hosted the best as players, or which one drew the most skillful singers of ghazals. It wasn't unusual for songs to echo late into the night, the melodies threading through alleys, drawing curious ears. But then there's the more peculiar tale, one that's passed around almost like a warning. Some old-timers swear that in certain coffeehouses, musicians could be spies. That reed flute wasn't just for ornament. It was said to conceal coded messages, rhythms tapped out in sequences that conveyed information to fellow conspirators. True or not, it's just enough to make you wonder when a drummer's hand lingers too long on a beat. Historians still argue whether these musical nights were tolerated because they soothed the crowd or condemned because they inflamed passions. Some claim rulers saw music as a harmless vent for energy. Others argue they feared songs could slip into satire, mocking officials under the cover of rhyme. Both might be true. You've certainly heard verses sharp enough to cut reputations, tucked slyly between romantic lines. For you, though, the music is half blessing, half hazard. A skilled oud player will pack the benches tighter than a festival day, cups flying out of your hands, coin clattering into your box. But a rowdy group of janissaries, already half drunk on their own bravado, might slam the table in time with the beat until the brazier rattles, demanding louder, faster, wilder. And when the night spirals like that, it's on you to keep the peace before strings snap or fists fly. One evening, you remember, a singer arrived uninvited, a wiry man with a voice like honey over gravel. He sang verses about lost loves, battles remembered, gardens of roses that never bloomed again. The room grew so hushed you could hear the sizzle of a coal. When he finished, no one clapped. They just breathed out, as if released from a spell, and then cups were raised in silent tribute. He left without asking for coin, and for weeks afterward, patrons asked if you could find him again. You never did. On quieter nights, the music becomes more personal. A solitary lute played by the fire, for the few customers who linger, the melodies winding like smoke up into the rafters. In those moments, you find yourself humming along without realizing, wiping cups in rhythm, the whole room caught in the same slow sway. You know then why men risk bans and raids to gather here. Because nothing else in the city feels quite like this shared silence broken only by music. And when the last note fades and the musician sets his instrument down, the room takes a collective breath, as though waking from a dream. Someone coughs, dice rattle again, coffee pours, but that fleeting unity lingers, like the taste of cardamom on the tongue. The music lingers in the rafters long after the last chord fades, but soon the rhythm changes. You hear the telltale stomp of heavy boots in the street outside, that martial cadence impossible to mistake. A ripple of awareness passes through the room, patrons straightening, conversations pausing as the doorway curtain stirs. And then they stride in, the janissaries. They are impossible to miss, even when off duty. Their uniforms carry the whiff of authority. Tall felt hats, heavy coats, sabers strapped though rarely drawn in a place like this. They move with the swagger of men who know the city bends around them, soldiers of the Sultan, but also notorious for making the capital itself their playground. A hush falls as they pick their seats, often at the central tables where their presence commands attention without a word. For you, their arrival is both blessing and curse. A group of janissaries guarantees a busy night. Other patrons will linger to bask in their energy, and the cups will multiply as quickly as the stories. Yet there's always that edge to the air, like holding a candle near dry paper. A single insult, a spilled cup, even a song they dislike could spark a fire no one wants. Mainstream history is clear. The janissaries were among the most frequent coffeehouse patrons in the 17th century, treating these spaces as extensions of their barracks. Coffeehouses became known as their second homes, and their rowdy energy both built and broke reputations for many keepers. But there's a quirkier side to their presence. Some chroniclers whisper that the janissaries had their own secret menu of coffee orders. One extra scoop of foam meant camaraderie. A dash of cinnamon meant mischief. A sugar cube slipped from hand to hand could even signify plans best left unspoken. True or not, you've had enough soldiers grin knowingly when you serve them to suspect there's more beneath the froth than flavor. Historians still argue whether the coffeehouse culture strengthened or weakened janissary discipline. Some claim it gave them camaraderie outside the barracks, tightening bonds between men who fought together. Others argue it loosened their grip on duty, making them rowdier, more politicized, even dangerous to the Sultan's own peace. Both sides have merit. Watching them roar with laughter over a bawdy tale one moment and then turn sullenly quiet at whispered mentions of a new tax the next, you can feel the instability in your own bones. Their habits are predictable yet unpredictable, a paradox you live with. They want endless cups of thick, black brew, brewed quick and hot, foam piled high like the plume of their helmets. They want pipe smoke wafting constantly, and sometimes they demand a song. Not politely. With fists on the table, stamping boots, daring anyone to refuse. You've seen a lute player hesitate once. Just once. The Janissaries had started to chant their own rhythm, pounding until the man finally strummed along, fingers trembling. By the end, he was grinning, carried away, as though their energy had infected him. But you couldn't ignore how pale he looked afterward, wiping sweat from his neck as if he'd escaped something. Still, there are nights when their presence turns golden. They laugh with the scholars, clap along with the storytellers, toss coins like dried leaves into your till. They flirt shamelessly with the pickle vendor's boy, tease the apprentices, buy sherbet for everyone in the room just to see the street seller squirm. The whole coffeehouse seems to vibrate with vitality when they're in that mood. And then there are the other nights. Nights when silence spreads in their wake, when they mutter among themselves, when every laugh sounds a little forced. You pour their cups carefully then, steady hands, respectful bows. You don't ask questions, and neither does anyone else. It's not just fear. It's recognition. These men carry the empire's weight, yet here they are, sipping the same bitter brew as you, leaning back on the same wooden benches. The power lines blur for a few hours, and everyone feels it, until the curtain lifts again, and they file back into the night, boots echoing down the cobbles, leaving your heart racing in their absence. The echoes of their boots fade into the streets, leaving the air lighter, as if a heavy lid has been lifted. You turn back to the hearth, stirring the coals with the tip of your long-handled tongs, and then you hear it, the slow, steady chant rolling over the rooftops. The call to prayer drifts in from the nearby mosque, rising above the clatter of dice and the hiss of the sezvs. It's a sound you can't escape, nor would you want to. The city breathes with these calls, marking time more faithfully than any clock. As the muezzin's voice floats through the night air, conversations pause, hands still halfway to lips, dice suspended mid-roll. A few patrons slip outside to wash and pray, sandals slapping on damp cobblestones, while others remain inside, heads bowed for a breath or two before lifting their cups again. You notice how the echoes change depending on the weather. On dry, clear nights, the voice rings sharp, cutting through the alleys like a blade of glass. But when it rains, the sound muffles, soaked into the sodden air, more like a hum pressed close against your ear. Tonight, the sky is dry, and the words ricochet off the coffeehouse walls, tangling with the laughter and the scrape of backgammon pieces. Here's a solid historical note. Ottoman coffeehouses often stood near mosques, deliberately or not. Some rulers tolerated them as long as their clientele didn't miss prayer, while others argued the two were in direct conflict. You've heard imams in fiery sermons condemn coffee as a distraction from worship, the devil's brew. And yet, the irony is plain. The sound of worship threads itself into your nights whether you want it or not. There's a quirky little tidbit you've picked up from the regulars. Some say the acoustics of Istanbul's narrow streets actually let the call to prayer bounce twice. If you stand in the right alley, you hear it once, then again, a ghostly repetition as if the heavens themselves are echoing the muezzin. Old men swear by it. You've tried it once or twice and couldn't decide if you were fooled by the stones or by your own ears. Historians still argue whether coffeehouses were tolerated precisely because they encouraged attendance at prayers, or whether they were despised for luring men away. Both arguments feel half-true. In your own shop, you've seen patrons slip out dutifully when the call sounds, then return, sleeves damp, beards dripping, ready for another round of conversation. Others mutter excuses and never move at all, stirring their coffee as if the muezzin were nothing more than background music. For you, the calls create rhythm. You measure your tasks by them. Before dawn, the grinding of beans aligns with the first chant. At midday, you expect the rush to swell right after prayer lets out. And in the evening, the call wraps the chatter in a silken pause. Even the rowdiest janissaries go still for a heartbeat, eyes flickering toward the shuttered windows, as if they remember, just for a second, that they are soldiers sworn to faith as much as to sword. But then the rhythm moves on. You refill cups, gesture to apprentices to clear ashtrays, and smile when one man begins reciting poetry again, his verses trying to weave themselves into the lingering melody outside. The air thrums with that mix only a coffeehouse can manage. Sacred words seeping in from the courtyard while inside, someone jokes about losing 3 straight games of backgammon. And you simply keep pouring, half listening to both. Because this is the Ottoman world you live in. A life balanced between prayer echoing from minarets and laughter rising from steaming cups. You learn early that coffee is rarely sold alone. It comes with a tab. The neat exchange, coin for cup, sounds civilized, but in the daily grind the economy is messy. Men arrive with pockets emptied by caravans or tightened by a bad harvest. Some have steady work, others live hand to mouth. So you, like every keeper before you, become an accountant by habit. Tracking who owes what, balancing favors, and holding your breath when a familiar face slips outside without payment. The common system is tactile. A man asks you to write it down. You notch a tally on a stick, scratch a mark under the bench, or fold a small chit with his symbol. That mark is a quiet contract between 2 people who trust each other enough to trade promises. When he returns with coins, you shave off a notch or hand back his folded slip. These marks are ugly currency, illegible to strangers but sacred to the regulars. The wood under the bench is warm with fingers. The chalk scrawls take on the faint smell of soot and ink from the day's receipts. It is, in fact, common across towns. Keepers recording debts on tally sticks or folded chits is an established practice in Ottoman cities. You see the same logic in every quarter: physical marks, shorthand, human memory, because paper and literacy aren't universal, and the trust economy runs on touch and name. Historians still argue whether coffeehouses functioned as proto-banks, offering crucial credit networks in an expanding empire. Some scholars see tabs as short-term credit that lubricated urban commerce. Others argue the system was too local and informal to qualify as banking. You don't join the scholars' quarrels. You watch the faces behind the marks. The mason expecting wages next week, the scribe promising payment when a patron clears an account, the widow who stitches tiny purses and needs a midday rest. Credit brings clients who might never enter otherwise. For them, the tab is compassion. You set rules: a maximum number of notches per person, a time limit before a debt grows stale, and an insistence that newcomers pay up front until trust forms. These limits preserve the house. Break them, and you risk turning the ledger into a bottomless pit. Sometimes you announce a no more than 5 notches policy after a bad month, and watch faces flush with frustration. Business and mercy often sit uncomfortably together. Risks come from disappearance and habit. Men leave town, are press-ganged, fall ill, or sink beneath misfortune. A vanished name is a notch you swallow. Some customers are perpetual debtors, charming, unreliable, and dangerously persuasive. You trade small kindnesses for their loyalty because a room full of familiar faces matters. Social capital sometimes offsets monetary loss. Still, there is a line. Habitual debtors degrade morale. You call them out with a firm tone or close their tab to set an example, because the house's survival depends more on reputation than on any single coin. IOUs enter the system as social currency. A merchant's folded promise may be passed to another keeper. Wait a week, he's solid. Credible names circulate like notes. You accept slips, sketches of promised silk, samples of spices. Barters are common and sometimes lovely. Once an old woman paid with a palace syrup recipe. Months later, a traveling cook converted it into beans for you. You once accepted a carved chessman as part payment. It became a prize at a backgammon match and earned more coin than you expected. These odd trades remind you that value wears many faces. Forgery and dispute are constant threats. Marks are coded: crescent notches, 3 dots, slashes for families or guilds, so a rival can't easily read them. Yet clever hands mimic symbols. A roaring argument once erupted over a disputed notch. Two men claimed the same mark until you read aloud the nights they sat, the coins they dropped, and a tattered scrap that had fallen from one man's sleeve. Social memory and a keeper's honesty often settle disputes, but sometimes magistrates are called, and that bruises the house's reputation. Neighborhood networks spread credit in informal webs. A baker extends bread if a customer promises to buy coffee at your place. The pickle vendor gives a sesame ring for a small errand. These reciprocal favors lubricate daily life. You are a node in that web, and with that role comes leverage and responsibility. Vouching for a stranger can open doors, or get you blamed if the stranger bolts. You once vouched for a man who turned out to be a confidence trickster. The embarrassment stung, and the lesson was sharp. Your word is currency too. Spend it carefully. Reputational credit is serious business. Someone may ask, is he trustworthy? Your word carries weight. You hedge. I've seen him honest once. Neither blessing nor damning, letting others decide. Vouching earns favors. The clerk you helped once later greased a permit for a brazier inspection. Small kindnesses can produce pragmatic returns. The ledger is thus both practical and diplomatic. There are darker ways credit shapes life. Family conflicts erupt when a son refuses to honor a father's tabs, or when a rival keeper claims debts belong to his house. Social pressure cures most cases. Public reminders, polite shaming, refusal of new coffee. Force is disastrous. Fights drive away customers and invite inspectors. You prefer persuasion and reputation to threats. The ledger only works when everyone believes the marks mean something. Otherwise, it's nothing but carved wood and folded paper. You also juggle wholesale credit. Your supplier trusts you to pay after sales. If bean prices spike or a cargo is delayed, your margins shrink. The risk of insolvency is real. You keep a hidden coin pouch sewn into your apron and a rigid minimum order to survive shocks. The same informal credit that helps neighbors can topple a keeper who overreaches. You learn to stagger orders and coax delayed payments from customers with charm and reminders. Sometimes the only thing between a thriving shop and a closed brazier is a furtive conversation at dawn or a delayed remittance arranged by a sympathetic merchant. Quirky customs dot the bookkeeping. One regular insists his tally be carved as a tiny crescent. Another uses 3 dots because he cannot write his name. Folklore fills the margins. Someone supposedly paid a huge debt with a promised marriage alliance. Another legend tells of a keeper who forgave a widow's tab and later received a sack of coins in a dream. Stories that instruct and entertain, blending morality and wishful thinking. Oddly, keepers sometimes hide chits inside loaves or tuck them into pipe cases to keep them safe. Secrecy, ritual, and superstition protect small credit as much as locks do. Historians still argue whether these tab systems stabilized urban life or entrenched inequality. Did they enable small businesses and smooth commerce, or did they allow wealthier patrons to exercise informal power over the poor? Both sit heavy when you notch a stick and look at the face attached to it. You cannot solve the empire's economics over a brazier. You can only choose how generous, how strict, how shrewd to be. Handling disputes requires diplomacy. Read the marks aloud, call witnesses, and offer repayment plans. Public shaming, refusal of service, or the intervention of a respected elder usually suffices. Sometimes barter and creativity solve the worst debts. A poem for a cup, a carved chessman for a night's shelter. When a debt is cleared, the satisfaction is simple. A nod, a shared pastry, the notch removed. In modern terms, your ledger is like a human Venmo, slower, smellier, and built of wood and rumor. It records not just numbers, but relationships. Each notch has a laugh, a cough, a face. Managing credit is messy, moral, and necessary. It makes you more than a keeper of cups. It makes you a keeper of trust. At closing, you have a final ritual. You run a cloth over the counter, align the cups, and then slide the tally stick into its secret hollow beneath the floorboard. The scratches are private and oddly comforting. Each nick is a small human promise that you helped hold together for a night. You breathe, listen to the brazier settle, and think of the faces whose marks you carry. Tomorrow, the dance resumes, foam, fires, and favors, and with it the steady, crooked arithmetic of survival. Coffee houses aren't just about beans and braziers. They're also about policing the space. Not in the sense of whips and batons, but in the subtler game of keeping order in a room built on smoke, gossip, and dice. Too much freedom, and the house collapses into chaos. Too much discipline, and no one returns. A keeper stands between those poles, performing the role of host, guard, and juggler. At the door, the first layer of policing is who you allow inside. Merchants? Always welcome. Students? Usually. Strangers? It depends. Janissaries in packs? Risky. They pay well but attract scrutiny. Drunks? Absolutely not, for alcohol is banned, and even suspicion can invite trouble. You develop a gatekeeper's eye, watching the gate, the clothes, the tone of voice. You've learned to spot a cheat by the quick twitch at his temple when he asks about steaks, and a troublemaker by the way he shoulders through a curtain rather than lifting it. Inside, rules are mostly unspoken, but universally felt. No loud blasphemy, no insults toward the sultan, no outright sedition. Dice games can rattle loudly, but mustn't spill beyond their corner. Storytellers can exaggerate, but not so much that their jests sound like satire of viziers. A pipe shared is fine, but not if its smoke chokes the room. Customers know these boundaries, but they test them constantly. Half because coffee sharpens the tongue, half because men crave the thrill of dancing near danger. Your role is nudging, not punishing. You cough loudly when a scholar strays into dangerous metaphors. You clap twice when dice grow too noisy. You place a hand on a shoulder when two men lean too close in argument. If they ignore you, you bring out the bigger tools, mockery. Are you rehearsing for a donkey's bray contest? Or social pressure? Brothers, even the brazier looks embarrassed. Shaming works better than force. A man laughed at by 20 peers is less likely to test his luck again. Yet true force sometimes enters, wearing turbans and swords. Inspectors and watchmen patrol the quarters, sniffing out unlawful gatherings. Sometimes they are sincere in their duty. More often they are half-seeking bribes. A knock at the door in the middle of the night can silence the entire room. You've learned to prepare. A small pouch of coins hidden near the counter, a spare tray of dates and sherbet ready to flatter. A well-timed offering can transform a raid into a casual visit. These inspections shape how you manage the house. You keep political debates coded in allegories. Foxes for viziers, lions for sultans, camels for bureaucrats. You allow music, but ban songs that mock authority. You even train your storyteller to pause mid-tale if a stranger enters, switching to a safe parable about saints or shepherds. The room is a theater where everyone knows when to drop the mask and play innocent. Policing also extends to cleanliness and comfort. A messy coffeehouse attracts rats and censure. You sweep twice daily, wash cups in hot ash water, and sprinkle rose water on the mats. If a pipe tips and spills sparks, you douse it before panic spreads. These small acts are not just housekeeping. They're discipline disguised as hospitality. Customers see a clean, orderly space and unconsciously conform to its mood. The greatest challenge is balancing factions. Merchants clash with students over noise. Janissaries clash with clerks over politics. Storytellers clash with musicians over volume. You learn seating strategies, placing rivals at opposite ends, giving dice players a corner away from scholars, seating powerful men where they can be seen and flattered. A badly arranged room can ignite fights. A wisely arranged one can turn potential enemies into uneasy companions. Still, fights do erupt. When voices rise and fists threaten, you don't leap into the fray. You signal regulars, trusted older patrons, who act as informal mediators. In every house there are men whose very presence calms tempers. You rely on them, rewarding them with free cups or first choice of cushions. They are unpaid deputies in your private police. If all else fails, you extinguish the brazier, a dramatic gesture that plunges the room into silence. No fire, no coffee. Arguments die faster than embers. Outlaws and cheats are another hazard. Some bring loaded dice, Others borrow endlessly and vanish. You handle them with quiet bands. The curtain lifted for others is dropped for them. Sometimes you whisper warnings to fellow keepers so the whole quarter learns who cannot be trusted. Coffeehouse networks act like guilds in this respect, protecting each other from parasites. Yet policing is not only about keeping chaos out. It is also about letting just enough chaos in. Too strict, and your shop feels sterile. Too loose, and it feels dangerous. People come because they crave the hum of argument, the laughter of risky jokes, the edge of gossip that might be forbidden tomorrow. You are the invisible hand shaping the limits. A successful keeper is remembered less for his beans than for his balance. How he kept the house alive as both sanctuary and spectacle. When the shutters close at night, the silence feels like victory. You've kept order without losing energy, welcomed voices without letting them run wild, and steered a crowd of strangers through another day of shared fire and foam. Tomorrow the same dance resumes, and you'll once again be policeman, host, trickster, and judge, all in one apron. If the art of keeping order is one tightrope, the art of storytelling is another, and tonight, you lean closer to the brazier while the room hushes for a meta. The professional storyteller whose tongue can stir more excitement than any dice or loot. Storytelling in the Ottoman Coffeehouse is not simply entertainment. It's the very spine of the space, the current that draws men back night after night. For who can resist a tale when it's told with smoke curling, cups clinking, and every eye fixed on a single performer? The meta stands with only a cane, a handkerchief, and his voice. That cane is not just a stick. It becomes a sword, a merchant's staff, or a shepherd's crook depending on the moment. The handkerchief morphs into a turban, a veil, or a purse of coins. With these two props, he conjures entire worlds. One moment he's a pompous vizier speaking in nasal tones. The next he's a bashful village girl squeaking her replies. You've watched him shift characters faster than a gambler shuffles dice, and each shift sparks a ripple of laughter or gasps across the room. Mainstream history tells us metas preserved oral traditions, spinning romances of Alexander or prophet stories to audiences who might never see parchment. But here's a quirkier tidbit. Some metas secretly borrowed lines from Italian commedia troupes visiting Istanbul's ports, slipping slapstick flourishes into epics. The blend of East and West made the tales unpredictable. Historians still argue whether this cross-cultural borrowing enriched Ottoman storytelling or watered it down. Yet your customers care less about purity and more about punchlines. Storytelling nights often start light, with jests about greedy merchants or bumbling servants. But then the tales grow sharper, slyly edging toward satire. A meta might describe a lion court where foxes control the treasury, and everyone chuckles, half knowing it's a jab at the bureaucracy. You glance at the door each time. The thin line between laughter and treason hums under every punchline. If an inspector stepped in, would he laugh too, or drag you all outside? That tension makes the air delicious. Not every tale is comic. Sometimes the meta plunges into Ghazis battling on distant frontiers, voices ringing with heroism and bloodshed. The younger men sit forward, cups forgotten, as if they themselves are wielding sabers. At other times, he recounts mystical journeys. Sufi saints traveling through deserts, conversing with jinns, or ascending beyond the spheres. These stories carry a dreamlike hush. The crackle of the brazier becomes the sound of celestial fire. As keeper, you become stage manager. You dim lamps slightly to heighten mood. You hush dice players with a sharp glance, so words can flow undisturbed. You even time coffee service, pouring just as a cliffhanger lands, so the gasp of steam echoes the gasp of listeners. The performance becomes a partnership, you and the meta weaving atmosphere together. But storytelling is not confined to professionals. Patrons themselves often take turns. A sailor tells of storms off Alexandria, embellishing each wave until it sounds like a sea monster. A pilgrim recalls Mecca, his voice trembling between awe and fatigue. A farmer shares a folk ghost tale, claiming his grandmother saw spirits in an olive grove. Each tale carries traces of truth and invention, but in this space, no one demands proof. The story itself is the proof. Some evenings, rival storytellers duel. One begins with a tale of trickery. Another interrupts with a wittier twist. The crowd sides with whichever can improvise best, cheering and clapping cups against the floor. These duels can stretch into hours, ending with exhausted laughter and the audience sprawling like men after battle. You let them because this chaos is golden. It ties men to your house tighter than rent contracts. Still, there are darker shades. Storytelling can be dangerous if too political, but also if too personal. Once, a meta mocked a patron's gate while imitating a miserly character. The man didn't laugh. Tension froze the room. Only when the meta dropped to his knees and begged forgiveness with absurd theatrics did the danger pass. You remember sweating through your shirt, praying no knives were drawn. Storytelling, you learned, is like walking through fire with bare feet. Dazzling, but scorching if misstepped. You notice too how tales shape memory. Men recall battles they never fought, romances they never lived, cities they never visited, because a meta painted them vividly. Coffee houses become miniature archives, where stories lodge deeper than chronicles. Perhaps centuries from now, historians will still argue whether what metas told reflects real Ottoman life or merely theatrical exaggeration. But here and now, the tales are real enough to keep men awake past midnight, eyes wide as if magic itself sat among the cushions. When the last punchline lands and the meta bows, you feel the energy ripple outward like embers cooling. Coins clink into his bowl, men stretch, dice rattle again, and cups refill. Yet for a moment, the room feels changed, bound together by a shared fiction, as if 100 strangers just lived one dream. That more than beans or braziers is why your house thrives. You are not just a keeper of coffee, but a keeper of stories, living, shifting, breathing through smoke and laughter. By the time dawn edges close, the dice have cooled, the meta's voice has fallen silent, and the backgammon boards are stacked once more, yet your coffee house does not empty. If anything, another type of guest begins to slip through the doors. The writers, poets, and thinkers who treat this smoky room like their laboratory. Coffee is their ink, your tables their parchment, and your patience their greatest gift. You notice the signs immediately. Instead of coins for dice or bread to soak up the brew, they clutch notebooks, scraps of parchment, or sometimes just recite lines aloud, scribbling later. Their eyes glow with that peculiar mix of exhaustion and ecstasy you see in men chasing words. They don't always buy much, but their words, if they catch on, draw followers who do, so you let them stay. Mainstream history notes how Ottoman coffee houses in Istanbul became hubs for literary circles. Men like Nabi and Nedim weaving verses while sipping bitter cups. But here's a quirkier tidbit. Some coffee houses became known for specializing in certain genres, almost like playlists. One street might be famed for love poetry, another for satire. Historians still argue whether these informal schools of coffeehouse poetry truly shaped Ottoman literature, or if the real shaping still happened in the palaces. You can't settle that debate, but you can feel how alive the words are here, crackling as fiercely as your brazier. A young poet stands on a stool, reciting a ghazal about roses and lips. His metaphors are so lush that even the gruffest artisan nods dreamily, forgetting the debts he cursed about moments earlier. Then a satirist interrupts, mocking corrupt officials with sly animal allegories. The room erupts in laughter, though you notice a few anxious glances at the door, always aware of the state's ears. Yet satire thrives here. It's safer to laugh in smoke than to print in ink. You become an accomplice in their rhythm. You refill cups at the exact beat between verses, your ladle clinking the brass pot like a drum keeping time. You keep the lamps trimmed just enough for ink and paper, but never so bright that fatigue chases away the muse. Some nights, you even feel like you're part of their poems, slipping in as a character, the keeper of cups, stirring midnight fire. One poet in particular, a gaunt man with too much coal smudged under his eyes, takes to reading epics aloud. He declaims of Alexander storming Asia, or lovers divided by seas, his voice vibrating like the string of an oud. The crowd listens half in reverence, half in disbelief, because who else but a coffeehouse poet can make history sound like prophecy? You know his verses might never see parchment, but for one night they live here, suspended in air. Sometimes the sessions grow rowdy. Rival poets duel with rhymes, their verses volleyed like arrows. The audience sides loudly, stamping feet and thumping cups on wood until the loser is drowned in noise. And when the poets grow too self-serious, hecklers rise, a cobbler shouting, "Make it rhyme with my empty purse." Laughter breaks the tension, and you, the eternal referee, smile at the chaos. Of course, the authorities know about this literary ferment. They suspect, perhaps rightly, that ideas ferment faster than beans in your pots. One rumor says a poem recited in a coffeehouse once sparked a tax riot 2 weeks later. Historians still argue whether this is legend or fact, but you've seen how swiftly words turn into whispers, whispers into grumbles, grumbles into fists pounding tables. The state fears more than coffee. It fears imagination made social. And then there are the mystics, the Sufi poets who drift in like shadows. They don't recite satirical jabs or boastful odes. Instead, they murmur of divine love, of the heart as a lamp, of the soul wandering like a moth. Their words slow the entire room. Even dice players grow still. You've seen tears roll down cheeks of men who would never cry at home. Coffee houses are not just taverns of wit. They're sanctuaries where longing finds voice. Yet, not every poet is welcome. Some arrive drunk from taverns, babbling rhymes that trip over themselves. Others pester customers for attention, waving pages like flags. You've had to escort a few outside before fists flew. It's part of the job, curating the flow of voices so the room hums, not splinters. You think sometimes about how future scholars might see this. Will they picture coffee houses as dens of idle chatter, or as crucibles of genius? The truth is both. A single night here might see gossip about a neighbor's goat, a fresh satirical couplet about a vizier, and an epic poem that could, if carried to the right ears, outlive everyone present. You hold this balance quietly, stirring sugar into cups while history stirs itself in your walls. And at dawn, when the poets stumble out, ink-stained and bleary-eyed, you sweep their crumpled scraps from the floor. Some you burn in the brazier, watching their words curl away in smoke. Others you tuck under jars or in drawers, not knowing why you keep them. Maybe because you sense that someday someone might call this age a golden one, and your coffee house, the very room where words were born, its furnace. You would think that after nights of poetry duels, dice clattering, and endless cups poured, the dawn would bring silence. But in your world, silence is a luxury you rarely taste. The morning light crawls over your threshold, and with it comes a different breed of visitor. The scholars, the bureaucrats, and the thinkers who treat your benches as a parliament in miniature. Their robes are neater, their turbans carefully arranged, and their conversation tastes less of roses and rhyme, more of law, policy, and empire. They gather around the largest tables, scrolls spread wide, their coffee cups lined like sentinels. Instead of poetry duels, you hear sharp debates about taxation, irrigation, even whether the Sultan's latest decree will strengthen or strangle commerce. Coffee houses in Istanbul were called schools of the wise, and now you see why. For the price of a single bitter brew, anyone can eavesdrop on the state's pulse. The mainstream fact is clear. Ottoman coffee houses became hotbeds of political chatter by the 17th century, so much so that multiple sultans tried banning them. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some officials, despite publicly condemning these places, were known to sneak in under disguise just to feel the city's heartbeat. Historians still argue whether these bans were genuine acts of moral concern or cynical attempts to choke political dissent. You don't need to argue. You see the tension in every hushed voice. At one table, a merchant insists that new tariffs on imported cloth will ruin his trade. At another, a retired janissary grumbles about stipends shrinking, his voice heavy with resentment. And then, sliding between these serious debates, comes a quieter murmur. Rumors of succession, whispers about which prince might rise next, which viziers' favor might be waning. You stir your pots with studied neutrality, pretending not to listen, though your ears catch everything. Every so often, the room sharpens with risk. A scholar reads aloud a passage of philosophy that some would label heresy. Another man responds with Quranic verses, his voice calm but firm. The debate grows heated, and the crowd splits into murmuring camps. You move through with a tray, a buffer of clinking cups, reminding everyone that your establishment is meant for talk, not fists. You are not just brewing coffee, you are brewing order. You also become a broker of information. Travelers leave behind tales of distant wars, caravans whisper of shortages in Damascus, sailors bring news from Venice. These scraps, traded across your benches, weave into a fabric richer than any official bulletin. By the time gossip reaches the markets, it's already been steeped in your room's smoky air. And then there are the conspirators. They always sit in corners, heads bent too close, hands gesturing subtly. Their coffee grows cold as they whisper of plots, some real, some imagined. Historians still argue whether the great uprisings of Istanbul had roots in taverns, barracks, or coffeehouses like yours. All you know is that the energy of rebellion often tastes like burnt beans and sleepless nights. But not all is treachery. Often, the political chatter is more comedic than dangerous. You've heard bureaucrats mock the absurdity of overlapping taxes, or joke about how many stamps it takes to send a petition through the imperial machine. The laughter is a safety valve, keeping the city sane. One night, a group composes a mock decree declaring that cats, too, must pay taxes in fish. Your room nearly collapses with laughter, cups spilling across the floor. Still, you can't ignore the weight of eyes. The state has spies. You've seen them, sharp-faced men who sip one cup too slowly, listening more than speaking. They pretend to be ordinary patrons, but their silence betrays them. You wonder sometimes whether your own words have been reported, whether a careless joke might cost you your livelihood. The paranoia doesn't stop you from serving, but it adds a layer of caution to your smile. And yet, strangely, there is comfort here. For all the risk, your coffeehouse gives common men a taste of equality. A janissary can argue with a scholar. A cobbler might mock a vizier's decree. In this room, status softens under smoke. Coffee flattens hierarchies. That is perhaps why the state both fears and cannot resist it. One morning, as you polish brass cups, a regular pauses mid-sentence, lowering his voice. "If these walls could talk," he whispers, "they'd hang us all." You chuckle softly because the truth is, your walls do talk, just not to the authorities. They echo in the rhythm of cups, the shuffle of benches, the words that linger long after the men have gone. When the debate's finally quiet and the scholars drift toward mosques and offices, you sweep the floor, brushing up crumbs of bread and scraps of paper filled with scribbles of numbers or half-written couplets. To anyone else, it looks like trash. To you, it's proof that your coffeehouse is more than a business. It's a parliament, a stage, a printing press without ink. And as you rake the ashes in the brazier, you wonder, not for the first time, whether history will remember the decrees of viziers or the mutterings that bloomed over your benches. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. But you know one thing with certainty. Every empire has palaces, but only a few have coffeehouses, and it is in those smoky rooms that power learns it has ears. By now, you've learned that your benches invite more than merchants, scholars, and poets. They also draw in artists who turn your dim room into a stage. Not all of them come with instruments slung over their backs. Some arrive with only their voice, their hands, their wit. Tonight the scent of roasted beans blends with something else, anticipation. A storyteller has claimed the corner cushion, and every man in the room leans forward, waiting for the tale to unfold. He begins softly, his voice like smoke curling upward. He spins epics of sultans, tricksters, and warriors, drawing gasps and laughter from the crowd. The candlelight flickers over his face, exaggerating every gesture. You watch as he stretches a single suspenseful pause until even you, who have heard it all before, feel your pulse quicken. Mainstream fact: coffeehouses became hubs of oral storytelling and shadow puppet shows in the Ottoman world. offering common people entertainment outside of elite palaces. But the quirky tidbit is that some storytellers were known to improvise wild endings, weaving audience members into the plot for comic relief. Tonight, one poor barber finds himself transformed into the cowardly villain, and the room erupts in laughter at his expense. You pour more cups, but slowly, so you don't miss the best parts. The room's rhythm is no longer chatter, but call and response. The storyteller gestures. The crowd answers with groans, cheers, or mock protests. The story becomes a living thing, shaped by the energy of the room. Historians still argue whether this art was simply folk entertainment, or whether it carried sly satire, coded critiques of rulers and laws. Sitting here, you suspect both can be true. A good story hides many layers, like coffee grounds swirling in the bottom of a cup. On other nights, musicians arrive with lutes, flutes, or even a drum tucked under one arm. They don't need stages, only the wooden bench and a crowd eager for rhythm. The first plucked string cuts through smoke, and suddenly even the dice players hush, their ears tilting toward melody. The music is raw, close, human. You can hear fingers sliding across strings, the sharp intake of breath before a verse. Sometimes the songs are devotional hymns, and the room takes on a hushed reverence. Other times they are bawdy folk tunes, mocking husbands, wives, or lazy apprentices. The laughter rolls like thunder, bouncing off the low ceiling beams. You notice the small rituals that repeat themselves every performance. Someone always claps out of rhythm and is shushed. Someone always insists on singing along though he knows only half the words. And inevitably, a table will pound their cups to demand an encore, turning your establishment into something like a tavern, only without the wine. It is in these moments that you realize your coffeehouse isn't just a business. It is a theater, a living archive of the city's moods. The energy grows more electric when shadow puppeteers arrive. They stretch a sheet against your wall, light a lamp behind it, and suddenly figures dance across the surface. The crowd greets familiar characters like old friends. Karagaz the trickster, Hasavat the straight man, their antics both ridiculous and oddly profound. Children sneak in, peeking from behind their fathers' robes, their giggles mixing with the men's guffaws. Again, the debate lingers. Were these puppet plays innocent fun, or thinly veiled satire of bureaucrats and sultans? You serve coffee quickly during these shows, because the room becomes so absorbed that no one wants to miss a punchline. Of course, not every performance goes smoothly. Sometimes a storyteller loses his thread, and the crowd turns restless. You've seen a dice game resume mid-tale, drowning out the poor performer's voice. Other times, rival musicians bicker over who gets to play first, their pride larger than their talent. On one infamous evening, two storytellers tried to outshout each other until the room dissolved into laughter. Not at the story, but at the storytellers themselves. You learn then that even failure becomes entertainment if framed correctly. You also notice how performances knit together strangers. A man from the docks and a scribe from the palace might never exchange words in daylight. But when the storyteller lands a perfect joke, they both slap the table at the same moment, grinning like old comrades. Coffee may fuel the body, but these tales and songs fuel the imagination, reminding everyone that they share not just streets and markets, but laughter and dreams. Still, you can't help wondering how much of this will endure. Historians still argue whether oral traditions truly survive beyond the voices that carry them. Without ink, will the tale of the barber-turned-villain vanish when the storyteller dies? Will the shadow puppets flicker only in memory? Yet, as you wipe down the counters, you realize that maybe permanence isn't the point. These performances are like steam rising from a fresh cup, fleeting, but unforgettable while they last. By the time the performers pack up, your floor is sticky with spilled coffee, your bench is worn from restless shifting, and your voice hoarse from calling orders over music. But you don't mind. Your room has once again transformed, shifting shape like a shadow on the wall. Marketplace in the morning, Parliament at noon, and tonight, a theater humming with laughter. You sweep the floor, humming one of the tunes that refuses to leave your head, and smile. Tomorrow, another performance will arrive, and once again your little shop will echo with stories that carry more truth than decrees. Tonight your benches creak beneath men who are not here to laugh or argue, but to sharpen their wits against one another. It begins with a scholar dropping a phrase of Arabic poetry into conversation, and suddenly the room shifts. The dice clatter quieter, the musicians lean back, and the crowd bends in to hear. Words, not dice, are the game now. Mainstream fact: Ottoman coffeehouses became celebrated arenas for poetry recitation, where verses were delivered with as much drama as any song. But here is the quirky tidbit. Sometimes customers would slip poems under cups as secret challenges, daring rivals to respond in kind. You once found a neatly folded scrap under an abandoned saucer, ink smudged with coffee, a single couplet daring some invisible opponent to outdo it. Historians still argue whether these duels of verse were purely playful contests or veiled commentaries on politics and power, safe only because they were couched in metaphor. A young poet rises, clearing his throat with theatrical gravity. He recites in a voice that quivers at first, then gains strength, lines about the moon's reflection trembling in a bowl of coffee. The crowd murmurs in approval, not for the literal image, but for the cleverness of binding your humble drink to celestial beauty. Then an older man smirks, mutters a counterverse that twists the image into satire, mocking the youth's lovesick tone. Laughter ripples. The young man reddens but grins, bowing at the rebuke. Even here, failure earns respect if you do it with grace. Sometimes debates turn sharper. A theological question may creep in, disguised in verse. Someone hints at free will, another at divine order, and suddenly the room teeters between entertainment and heresy. You feel your palms sweat because a careless phrase could bring trouble from the outside. You pour more cups to break the tension, the hiss of steaming water acting as a mediator. On other evenings, riddles dominate. A man poses one. What is black when served, white when finished, and invisible when forgotten? The answer, of course, is coffee itself. The room applauds the clever twist, though some insist the answer should be smoke, or ink, or even shadow. Here, precision matters less than creativity. Someone wagers a full tray of cups that no one can best his riddle, and by dawn, the wager is lost in laughter, but you pocket the coin all the same. You notice how these competitions mimic the empire's larger rhythms. Just as officials spar with decrees, here men spar with syllables. Words replace swords, rhyme replaces steel. But the pride is the same. To falter is to lose face. To triumph is to feel immortal, if only for a night. You recall one evening when a wandering dervish took the floor. He spoke not in rehearsed couplets, but in spontaneous, swirling speech, his words tumbling faster than anyone could follow. He linked the bitterness of coffee to the bitterness of longing for God, each sip a reminder of the soul's hunger. The room fell silent, captivated, some men blinking back tears. Others whispered uneasily that this was dangerous territory, too mystical, too close to blasphemy. Historians still argue whether such mystical recitations were tolerated because they were couched in metaphor or because the state quietly recognized their power to soothe restless hearts. At times, the contests spill into absurdity. One night, two rivals battled to see who could recite the longest chain of rhymes ending in the same syllable. After an hour, their words had lost all meaning, reduced to pure sound, the crowd roaring at every forced rhyme. You had to bang a spoon against a tray to declare them both victors before the madness consumed the whole night. These contests also draw outsiders. A scribe might arrive from the palace, curious to hear what the common man makes of poetry. A merchant might fund a prize for the winner, just for amusement. Sometimes even janissaries lean in, awkwardly tossing verses like spears. The mixing of classes is as remarkable as the verses themselves. Where else could a dockworker's quatrain silence a scholar, or a barber's limerick win applause from a silk merchant? You suspect the empire's future will remember these contests less than its wars and decrees. But sitting here, watching men duel with nothing but ink, breath, and pride, you feel the weight of history in every rhyme. These evenings prove that empire is not just built on walls and cannons, but on words spoken across low wooden tables, punctuated by steam rising from chipped cups. And so you keep pouring. Another round for the young poet licking his wounds. Another for the old cynic sharpening his wit. Another for the silent men who will carry fragments of tonight's verses into the streets, whispering them until the lines spread like smoke across the city. Tomorrow, no one may remember who spoke first, but they will remember that the words lived, sparred, and burned bright for a few hours in your coffeehouse. Tonight the air in your coffeehouse vibrates with the rise and fall of stories, less measured than poetry, but just as magnetic. A man with calloused hands slaps his thigh, launching into a tale of a shipwreck he never saw, and everyone leans closer because detail, not truth, is the coin of this trade. Mainstream fact: Ottoman coffeehouses were central venues for oral storytelling, where professional meta-narrators or amateurs could mesmerize an audience with history, legend, and gossip. Quirky tidbit: some storytellers used props as simple as a stick or handkerchief, shifting them between characters to signal dialogue. Cheap theater without scenery. Historians still argue whether these stories were mere entertainment or subtle vehicles for political commentary, smuggled into metaphor to avoid censorship. You've seen the professionals at work. A meta stands, clears his throat, and without introduction he becomes a sultan, then a beggar, then a lion, voices twisting with uncanny skill. He flicks his walking stick to show anger, waves his kerchief for sadness, and suddenly the room believes they are in a palace garden or a battlefield in distant Persia. Cups cool on tables, dice rest forgotten, even the gossipers hush to catch the cadence of his words. Sometimes the stories are moral lessons. Greedy viziers punished by fate, humble fishermen rewarded by divine justice. Other nights they're pure escapism. Jinn tricking humans, enchanted birds whispering secrets, heroes crossing deserts on impossible quests. You notice how the listeners, men ground down by daily labor, cling to these tales like lifelines. A porter may never see Baghdad, but through the meta's voice he travels its alleys, smells its spice markets, and fears its bandits. The crowd loves embellishment, the more outrageous the better. You once heard the same meta tell the conquest of Constantinople 3 nights in a row, each time adding new miracles. Angels shielding soldiers, walls that crumbled at a touch, the sea itself bowing to Mem's fleet. The scholars in the corner frowned, muttering that such exaggerations insult history. But the crowd roared for more, and the meta knew which side fed him coin. And gossip, of course, slips between the tales. A barber tells of a janissary brawling in a bathhouse, weaving enough flourishes to make it legend. A merchant swears the Grand Vizier's nephew was caught sneaking into the harem disguised as a lute player. Obviously false, but told with such gusto that no one dares laugh it off. These half-truths give the coffeehouse its dangerous edge, for news here spreads faster than decrees on palace paper. One night, you remember, a meta slipped into satire. He described a pompous bird who strutted about giving orders, only to be trapped by his own tail feathers. Everyone laughed, too loudly, because everyone knew which official he meant. You held your breath, praying no spy sat among them. Historians still argue whether meta were tolerated because they amused the public or because they offered a safety valve, mocking authority, so the anger didn't boil over elsewhere. But not all stories are grand. Some are as small as a boy who lost a sandal in the mud and wandered half the city before finding it again. The storyteller wrings such absurd pathos from the tale that grown men chuckle like children. And you realize it isn't the plot but the rhythm, the shifting tones, the shared laughter that matter. Sometimes the stories carry prayers. A dervish spins parables of the prophet, reminding listeners of mercy, patience, humility. The room softens, men bow their heads, and for a few moments the coffeehouse feels like a mosque, though the smell of roasting beans replaces incense. The quiet doesn't last. Soon someone cracks a joke about angels needing coffee too. But for a heartbeat the place feels sanctified. You've noticed how stories cling to objects. A chipped cup becomes the cup used by a prince in disguise. A broken lute string becomes the very string that snapped when love was lost. Even your own broom was once used by a meta as a sword, sparking a mock duel that had the crowd howling. You wonder whether your furniture holds more history than the palace halls, simply from being woven into so many tales. By dawn, the stories leave residue like steam on glass. Men repeat fragments as they leave, reshaping them for wives, apprentices, strangers on the ferry. By tomorrow, today's tale will be told again across the city, warped like clay in too many hands. Perhaps that is the true power of the coffeehouse, not the accuracy of information but its velocity, spreading through alleys like wildfire. As you wipe the counters, you hear echoes, the pompous bird, the lost sandal, the shipwrecked sailor. They're stitched into the city now, anonymous and unstoppable. You smile, because you know tonight new ones will be born. And in this endless relay of voices, your coffeehouse is both cradle and grave, the place where stories live for a night before flying out to find their own lives. The first clink of metal signals a shift in the night's music. Dice rattle, coins shuffle, fingers drum impatiently on tabletops. Tonight, the patrons are restless, hungry for wagers. You can smell it, the sharp scent of risk mixing with the bitter aroma of coffee grounds. The games begin. Mainstream fact: gambling, though officially frowned upon in Ottoman law, found fertile ground in coffeehouses where authorities often looked the other way. Quirky tidbit: some men believed rubbing a coffee bean between their palms before a throw brought luck, a kind of homespun talisman. Historians still argue whether such games were tolerated as harmless distractions or condemned as threats to social order that lured men away from work and prayer. You watch as a mason spreads knucklebones across the table, polished smooth from use. He calls for challengers, and a tanner jumps in, coins already sweating in his palm. Their voices rise, half playful, half feral. A crowd gathers instantly, for the spectacle matters almost as much as the outcome. The games vary. Some toss dice into cups, trying to call totals before the clatter stops. Others play cards, imported from Venice and painted with faded suits, their corners curled from hundreds of hands. Still others invent makeshift contests, predicting which fly lands first on a window frame, or whether the oil lamp will sputter before dawn. To a man with little to his name, any uncertainty can become a gamble. You've seen fortunes turn in minutes. A porter doubles his week's wages and struts out like a conqueror, only to return the next night hollow-eyed and broke. A scholar, claiming disdain for such frivolities, accidentally sits close enough to be dealt in. And once, a janissary stormed out after losing badly, swearing he'd report everyone, only to sneak back a week later with new coins and a sheepish grin. Sometimes the game's sour. Two men accuse each other of cheating, fists slam tables, and the air bristles with rage. You remember having to step between them once, broom in hand like a staff, pretending your shaking arms were authority. Coffee splashed, curses flew, but somehow the quarrel fizzled when the dice rolled under a bench and vanished. The men laughed nervously, agreeing the dice themselves had passed judgment. Superstition wraps around the wagers. A man refuses to sit near the door, claiming it lets luck escape. Another insists on sipping coffee only from the left side of his cup before playing. And once you overheard a regular mutter blessings in 3 languages before throwing, just to cover all divine bases. Luck is democratic, they believe, as willing to bless a beggar as a bay. But luck also makes enemies. A shoemaker on a winning streak soon finds his friends drifting away, muttering that no one can be so lucky without cheating or sorcery. You see isolation bloom on his face, even as his purse grows fat. Maybe that's why winners so often buy drinks for the room, to turn suspicion back into admiration. You've heard authorities describe gambling as a plague, a seed of crime, a danger to families. Yet the coffeehouse hums with it nightly, like a stubborn pulse. Perhaps, you think, the danger isn't in the coins lost, but in the fire it lights. Men who feel powerless during the day get to tempt fate at night, daring the universe to notice them. And for a fleeting moment, the roll of dice makes them rulers of chance. One memory clings. An old meta once joined a game, wagering not coins but verses. If he lost, he'd recite a poem on command. If he won, the losers had to clap him out the door in triumph. He lost every round, deliberately or not, and the coffee house filled with impromptu recitations, sad, funny, absurd. The gamblers forgot their coins, and for a night wagers became art. Still, dawn always comes. You sweep the last dice off the floor, tuck the abandoned deck back onto a shelf, and wipe the table sticky with spilt coffee. Luck, you realize, doesn't linger. It clings only while men believe, then drifts away like steam from the cups. Tomorrow night, they'll chase it again, and you'll be here to watch the chase unfold, steady as the walls around them. Midnight presses close like a heavy velvet curtain. The last of the cups sit drained on their saucers, rings of cooled coffee marking the wooden tables like faded moons. You move quietly, not wanting to startle the few regulars still lingering in the shadows. They sit half-slumped, nursing the dregs of conversation rather than the drink, their laughter reduced to gentle murmurs, their shoulders sagging beneath the weight of fatigue. Mainstream fact: many Ottoman coffeehouses closed at midnight or shortly after, partly to discourage disorder, though exceptions thrived in port districts and caravanserai neighborhoods where traffic never ceased. Quirky tidbit: some keepers whispered charms before shuttering, believing it warded off thieves or wandering spirits that might slip in through the cracks. Historians still argue whether these nightly closures reflected genuine moral regulation or were simply practical limits of manpower and fire safety. You begin the ritual of ending the night. First, the embers. Long iron tongs pinch glowing coals from the brazier, dropping them into a clay pot so they can cool safely. The hiss and crackle mark the final song of the fire. Next, the lamps. One by one, you pinch their wicks or blow gently until smoke curls upward, weaving ghostly patterns in the dark. The room shrinks with each extinguished light, corners dissolving into shadow until only your lantern near the counter holds out. The stragglers sense it too. One yawns wide, stretching like a cat before stumbling to his feet. Another mutters something about debts to settle tomorrow and pats your shoulder on the way out. Doors creak, sandals slap stone, the murmur of the night street folds them away. Soon, silence seeps in, so thick it feels like fabric pressed against your ears. You slide the wooden shutters closed, their iron latches clanging softly. The smell of roasted beans lingers heavy in the still air, mixed with sweat, pipe smoke, and faint rosewater. You let it settle, a perfume of everything the day contained: gossip, laughter, anger, wagers, philosophy. Tomorrow it will return again. Tonight, you keep it bottled between these walls. Alone now, you drop onto a cushion. Your legs ache, your hands sting from scalds you barely noticed while working, your eyes blur with exhaustion. And yet, beneath it all, there's satisfaction. You've tended the fire of conversation, you've kept the cups filled, you've watched a community knit itself together and fray apart and knot itself again. All within these few smoky meters of wood and stone. The brazier is cold now. The lantern flickers once, twice, then steadies. You know you should sleep. But your mind drifts, circling everything you've seen. The janissaries swaggering, the merchants scheming, the scholars debating, the storytellers weaving, the gamblers groaning, the lovers stealing glances. A coffeehouse is a mirror of the city itself, you think. And somehow you, with your humble apron and scorched fingertips, are its keeper. You stretch, ease down onto the cushions, and let your eyes close. Outside, a stray dog howls, and the Bosphorus whispers against its shores. Inside, silence reigns, but beneath it hums the promise of tomorrow's first cup, tomorrow's first word spoken over steaming foam. Sleep takes you softly, like a friend's hand on your shoulder. Now the shutters are closed, the embers cooled, and the night belongs only to you. Let your breath slow, deep and steady, like the gentle rhythm of waves brushing against an unseen shore. Imagine the coffeehouse empty and still, cushions stacked neatly, cups gleaming faintly in the low light, every sound hushed except for the soft hum of your own thoughts. The world outside may still be awake, footsteps echoing in distant alleys, owls stirring in the minarets, ships rocking quietly in the harbor, but none of it presses against you here. Inside, there is only calm. The smoke that once swirled thick has dissolved, leaving the air clean and light. Even the smell of roasted beans has softened into something warm and comforting, like a blanket draped across your shoulders. Picture yourself lying back, the cool floor beneath you grounding, the faint cushion at your head inviting you deeper into rest. Each moment stretches longer, smoother, until time itself feels unimportant. There is no rush, no task undone, no noise demanding your attention. The only task now is to let go, to let the silence cradle you as securely as the wooden beams hold up the roof. Let your eyelids grow heavy, your muscles soften, your thoughts scatter like ashes on the wind. If memories return, let them drift past like shadows. Acknowledge them, then watch them fade. You are safe here, you are at ease, and the night is vast enough to hold you gently. Sleep comes slowly, steadily, like the last glow of a lantern dimming until it merges with the dark. And when you wake, the world will still be waiting, cups ready, stories untold, mornings fresh. For now, though, surrender. Rest. Drift. Dream.